Robert Baratheon woke from a fathomless darkness with a gasp that tore his chest. His eyelids fluttered, and a dim blur of candlelight wavered above him like ghosts dancing over the battlefield. For one terrible moment, he did not remember where he was, nor why every part of his body seemed aflame with pain. Then the smell of linen, herbs, and dried blood filled his nostrils. A single voice drifted through the haze, Maester Tyrell muttering. He felt a cool cloth dab at his brow, heard a metallic clink of tools on a tray. He was in his bedchamber in the Red Keep, he realized, not in the depths of some fever dream on a boar hunt. He tried to rise, and his ribs screamed at him in defiance. Every muscle felt torn and raw, as though he had been gored 10 times over. But he was alive. The last thing he remembered was the beast's tusk splitting through his side, the wine-addled misstep that had made him easy prey, and then the white-hot pain that had nearly pulled him into oblivion. Yet here he was, his heart still pounding with reluctant vigor, the dryness in his mouth as parched as the Dornish sands. Cersei was the next face he saw. She hovered at the foot of the bed, pale and drawn in a manner he had seldom seen. Her usual mask, the forced smiles, the flicker of cunning in her gaze, was replaced by something that approached genuine concern. When he met her eyes, she did not look away. She only stood there, stoic, and Robert wondered if she was relieved or disappointed. The idea of her disappointment made him grit his teeth, for it stung more than the boar's tusk. Yet he had no time for her cunning. The realm needed him. "Your Grace," Maester Tyrell droned, noticing the king's stirring. "You are awake. 7 be praised." The old man waddled closer, leaning over Robert to examine the bandages that wrapped his torso. "We feared for you. The fever was fierce, and the wound. Truly, the gods have granted you a boon." Robert snarled at the mention of gods. "They granted me no boon," he growled, though his voice cracked. He coughed, and pain rocketed through his side. Anger flared in his belly, a small comfort that reminded him of life. "They just never had the guts to take me. I've spat in their faces too many times to count. My time's not done yet." Cersei pressed her lips together, her expression solemn, but she said nothing. Robert wanted to bellow at her silence, to demand whether she had conspired in his fate somehow, whether she had contrived that the wine be poured too freely, whether she had some hand in leading him to that monstrous boar. But no, accusations could wait. The realm had bigger problems than the cunning of one queen. He would watch her carefully, though. She would not find him so easily subdued this time. He looked around, searching for a man who had not shown his face yet. "Ned," he rasped. "Where is Ned Stark?" When the king insisted, nothing could hold him back. Servants scurried out to fetch the Lord of Winterfell. Ned arrived soon after, that grave face of his set in stone. The moment Ned entered, a burden seemed to lift from the air. Robert had not realized how alone he felt until he saw his old friend. Ned's gray eyes flicked over the king's state, and the relief there was genuine. "Robert," Ned said softly, standing by the bed. "They told me you woke." Robert managed a wry grin. "I did, Ned. The boar didn't finish me after all." He tried to shift again, gasping when he felt the lances of agony shoot through him. "I need to talk to you alone." The tension in the room mounted. Cersei's face tightened. She gave the king a formal bow and departed. Maester Tyrell, after a few more fussing checks, followed her out with a waddling step. Outside, the hush of the hallway seemed to stretch, but Robert paid it no mind. He gestured Ned closer. "They wanted me good and drunk," Robert murmured. "I'll not forget that. It might have been the Lannisters, it might not. But I'll have no more of it, Ned." He gripped Ned's wrist, the thick muscles of his arm trembling with the effort. "No more. For too long. I've let them run the realm while I drank myself blind. No more." Ned took the king's hand gently, mindful not to jostle the bandages. "You need rest, Robert. You nearly died. Let the realm wait. It has waited long enough for your recovery." "No," Robert barked, then broke into a cough. When the fit subsided, his eyes were dark with anger. "I am king, And what sort of king is done in by a pig? The realm thinks me a fool, and perhaps I've been one. But not now. From this moment on, things will change. You'll help me with that, Ned. You must. Ned said nothing for a moment, then nodded slowly. Of course, Your Grace. Robert sagged back against his pillows, bone-weary. First, we deal with the succession, the finances, and the damned Lannisters all at once. I'll not be their puppet. Ned inclined his head once more, and they lapsed into silence, the weight of the conversation settling. Outside, the stifled bustle of the Red Keep went on. Courtiers hurrying about, guards at their posts, maids with baskets of linens. But within the king's chambers, a new future was being born. In the days that followed, Robert's health wavered. He was too weak to hold court at first, but he insisted that those who needed his presence come to him in the bedchamber. Grand events were postponed, and the usually boisterous halls of the Red Keep felt subdued by an unseen hand. Rumors spread like wildfire, that the king was dying, that he had already died, that the boar's tusks had done irreparable damage. But Robert lingered, and, with every dawn, he found his strength a little less fleeting. Ser Barristan Selmy stood guard by his bedside more often than not. The old knight's dignity and impeccable sense of honor brought Robert some measure of comfort. Yet in the hush of night, when the pain was at its worst, Robert would recall that slender, golden-haired knight who had grown in fame with every passing year, Ser Loras Tyrell. The Knight of Flowers had proven himself a bold and gifted warrior. Even in his drunken dreams, Robert recognized that Loras, for all his youth, was fearless, cunning, and skilled. The man who slew the boar after Robert had collapsed had been one of his sworn huntsmen, but Ser Loras was the one who rode out that day and kept a watchful eye on the king, until the last fateful moment when the boar's charge came too swiftly. Something in Robert's mind lingered on that memory. Loras was not only a dashing figure, but also someone who seemed unafraid of the shadows cast by the Lannisters. He began to conjure an idea that swelled in his mind as the nights passed. Naming a new Lord Commander would send a message. The realm was entering a new era, an era where Robert's will would no longer bow to the manipulations of others. But first, he had to see it for himself. He had to see Loras test his mettle in more than just gifts and flower offerings. Finally, the day came when Robert insisted on leaving his bed. Maester Pycelle puffed and complained, but the king forced himself to stand. His muscles trembled like those of a newborn colt, yet with Ned's firm support, he made his way to the throne room. The great hall seemed to expand before him with an echoing hush. Servants halted in their duties to watch as the king entered, shoulders set despite the pallor in his cheeks. Cersei stood to one side, Joffrey beside her, and they exchanged a glance that was too brief for Robert to interpret. If the boy was disappointed that his father still lived, he kept it carefully shielded behind a rehearsed expression of concern. Varys hovered near a pillar, a slight bow acknowledging the king's presence. Littlefinger did much the same. Grand Maester Pycelle waddled behind, muttering about bed rest, though he knew it was useless to protest any longer. Robert ascended the steps to the Iron Throne, each step making his wound throb, each breath a chore. Yet he persevered. He sat, letting the metal press into his back, feeling the cold bite of the jagged edges through the thick velvet of his robe. He looked out at those assembled, summoning as much of his old commanding presence as he could. "Bring Ser Loras Tyrell," he commanded. "I wish to speak with him." The summons did not take long to fulfill. Loras came, wearing a plain tunic of green and gold, shorn of any extravagant armor. He dropped to one knee before the throne, wavy brown-gold hair brushing his forehead. "Your Grace," he said, voice resonant in the hush. Robert studied him. The Knight of Flowers was indeed young, his face unscarred by the hardships of real war, but his eyes held a quiet confidence that Robert had not expected. "Ser Loras," Robert began, voice echoing through the hall, "I have heard many speak of your valor. I have also seen you tilt at tourneys. You ride well, fight well, and have the favor of the small folk who admire your courtesy and gallantry. Is that right?" Loras bowed his head. I only try to do my duty, Your Grace. My skill in the lists is as much a product of my father's training as any natural talent. Robert offered a thin smile, one that made the watchers hold their breath. A humble knight. Good. Humility is a quality we need more of in King's Landing. He let his gaze flick to Cersei briefly before returning to Loras. I have it in mind to change things in my Kingsguard. Ser Barristan Selmy has served me well, but times are shifting. My days of inaction are over. I want new blood, a new face to show the realm that this king remains strong. Ser Loras Tyrell, I want you in my Kingsguard, and not just as a white cloak, but as Lord Commander. A ripple of shock passed through the hall. Ser Barristan, standing not far away, stiffened. His face betrayed only the barest flicker of emotion, but everyone knew his pride and sense of duty. Cersei's lips parted. She looked as though she might protest, but something in Robert's fierce expression silenced her. Even Ned's brow furrowed as he watched his friend's bold move. It was almost unheard of to dismiss a Lord Commander of the Kingsguard who was still of sound mind and body, particularly one so storied and respected as Barristan Selmy. Loras's eyes widened. For a moment, surprise warred with a sense of deep gratitude. He lowered his gaze. Your Grace, he said softly, I am honored beyond words, but Ser Barristan. Ser Barristan is a good man, Robert said bluntly, but you will replace him. I want him to remain in the Kingsguard if he chooses, though I suspect the old man has had enough. Still, I'll not force him to leave his white cloak. But the role of Lord Commander will be yours, if you swear to me that you will protect my life, the lives of my heirs, and remain loyal above all else. Loras's heart hammered in his chest. He glanced at Ser Barristan, who maintained a stony composure, then bowed his head in acceptance. I swear it, Your Grace. My life, my sword, my every waking breath shall serve you. Barristan drew in a silent breath, then nodded once, stiffly, acknowledging this abrupt turn of fate. Robert, well aware of the tension in the room, only found his determination growing. He had spent too long being manipulated, letting those around him play at power while he drank and hoard. This was only the first step in reclaiming his throne for himself. That same evening, in the king's private chambers, Ned came to Robert once more, concern evident in his gray eyes. What you did, naming Loras Tyrell as Lord Commander, that is unprecedented. Robert sank into a chair, fatigue creeping into his bones. I need allies, Ned. Ones who aren't beholden to the Lannisters. The Tyrells command one of the greatest armies in Westeros, and they have been overshadowed by the Lannisters since the end of the rebellion. This move binds me to them. It reminds the Lannisters that I haven't forgotten my crown. Also, Loras is young, he'll owe me everything. I'd rather have a man of skill and ambition who answers to me than an old hero who answers only to tradition. Ned's gaze shifted to the window, beyond which the city sprawled. Ser Barristan's honor is beyond question. If he feels slighted, the realm will see it as a shameful dismissal of one of its most beloved knights. Men will talk. Let them talk, Robert growled. I am king. I'll do as I will. Then his voice softened. But I'll keep Ser Barristan on if he'll stay. He will have a place in the Kingsguard. I don't mean to spit on him, but we can't dance around Ned, not anymore. Ned exhaled, nodding slowly. The lines on his face seemed to deepen. As you say, Your Grace. Within a fortnight, Loras Tyrell donned the white cloak of the Kingsguard. The official ceremony was quick yet striking, held in the courtyard before a modest assembly. The hush that fell when Loras draped the white cloak over his golden tunic was profound. As Lord Commander, he swore his vows before the king, before the realm, and the onlookers whispered among themselves about the future of this new Kingsguard. Ser Barristan stood off to the side, his face carved from ice, but he did not protest. Many guessed that the old knight's sense of duty kept him from any display of anger or betrayal. If he felt bitterness, he hid it well beneath a cold acceptance. For Loras, this was the highest honor imaginable, and a weight he had not expected to bear so soon in his life. His father, Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden, wrote a series of letters that arrived in secret, praising his son's new station. The Tyrells considered this a grand coup, placing their most charming scion in the highest seat of martial honor in the realm. Lady Olenna Tyrell, known as the Queen of Thorns, sent a letter as well. This one wry and cautionary, reminding Loras that the game at court was deadly and complicated. He must be cunning and fierce to survive, lest the Lannisters and others with hidden knives try to discredit him or use him as a pawn. He took her words to heart, and so, the Red Keep found itself filled with the subtle tension of a shifting tide. Rumors multiplied that the king no longer trusted his own wife's house, that he was forging alliances with the Tyrells, that he might repudiate his queen in favor of forging a new marriage. With every rumor, the cracks in the Lannister-Baratheon alliance grew a touch wider. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon forced himself to walk more each day, to appear in the yard and watch the men train. He insisted on holding council meetings in the solar rather than letting his small council come to him in bed. Though his wound still pained him, he clung to his newfound resolve. This led to an audit of the crown's accounts, something that had been deferred for too many years under Littlefinger's cunning manipulations. The king's fury at the depth of the debt to the Iron Bank of Bravos was monumental, and he demanded to know how such negligence had been allowed. Peter Baelish offered his usual glib excuses: wars to pay for, the cost of running the royal household, the extravagances the king himself demanded. Robert's voice thundered in response, shaking the walls. Littlefinger played his part expertly, appearing contrite, offering solutions that revolved around increased taxes, new trade routes, and cunning manipulations. Ned Stark, ever the honorable friend, sat quietly at these meetings, watchful of both the Lannisters and Littlefinger, mindful that if Robert's efforts slipped into aggression, civil war might loom. Varys, though smiling and offering soft-spoken counsel, was a serpent in Ned's mind. The Master of Whisperers had 1,000 ears in the city, and none of them could be trusted. Only Stannis was missing, absent in Dragonstone, and Renly was more concerned with fashion and feasts than the realm's accounts. Ned felt more alone than ever in trying to keep the king tethered to reason. Loras Tyrell's appointment began to yield its own consequences. He commanded the Kingsguard with a youthful energy that surprised his sworn brothers. Some, like Meryn Trant and Boros Blunt, bristled at the notion of a younger man leading them. Others, like Aerys Oakhart, found Loras's skill in the practice yard inspiring. Jaime Lannister said little, though he was notably absent from the Red Keep more often after Loras's appointment, disappearing on supposed errands for the queen, or simply riding about the city. Cersei, for her part, seethed in private at the slight done to her own brother, but she held her tongue, likely waiting for a more advantageous moment to strike back. Robert, aware of the tension, summoned Loras to his chambers one evening. The king was seated at a heavy oaken table, sipping a cup of watered wine rather than his usual strong vintage. His face was still wan from his convalescence, but his presence carried a sharper edge these days, like a sword newly honed. "Ser Loras," Robert said, gesturing for the new Lord Commander to sit. Loras did so carefully. "I'll not mince words. You're young, and many in the court don't think you're up to this task. You need to prove them wrong." Loras dipped his head. "I understand, Your Grace. I will do all in my power to show them. The Kingsguard must be worthy of its name." Robert snorted. "So it must. You'll also find that court is a nest of vipers. They'd like nothing better than to see you fail, or see you undone by scandal. Keep your wits, boy." A flicker of steely determination shone in Loras's eyes. "I will, Your Grace. I assure you that I have no intention of being used." Robert nodded, satisfied. He regarded Loras with something like fatherly frankness for a moment. "Have you heard from your father?" "Yes, Your Grace," Loras replied. "Lord Tyrell is overjoyed at my appointment, though he counsels me to be careful in all my dealings. My grandmother, Lady Olenna, sent me similar advice. She believes that House Lannister will not take this slight without responding." "Old Lady Olenna is a wily one," Robert said with a small laugh. "She's right. expect them to strike at your flank. But you have me, lad. I won't let them unseat you so easily." For a moment, there was a pause where Loras remembered all his grandmother's warnings about how quickly favor at court could vanish. He had to secure more than just a whimsical appointment. He would have to earn the respect of the other knights, the admiration of the common folk, and perhaps even a genuine bond with the king. A few days later, whispers reached Loras. The king planned to hunt again, defying the advice of his maester, his Queensguard, and even Ned Stark. Robert insisted that to appear timid after surviving a boar attack would be the greatest admission of weakness. He wanted another hunt, a grander spectacle, to celebrate his continued reign over life itself. The new Lord Commander felt a chill at the thought. It was a foolhardy idea, especially with Robert's wound not fully healed. Yet he could not refuse the king, nor could Ned, nor anyone else. So they prepared. The morning of the hunt was crisp, the sky a clear blue. A party of about 20 set out, including Robert, swathed in a mail shirt and cloak, Ned Stark, Joffrey, who demanded he be included, though his presence drew scowls from his mother, and of course Ser Loras, leading 5 other Kingsguard knights. The king would not be parted from his new Lord Commander, as if to show the realm that he had every confidence in this young knight. Servants trailed behind with packs of provisions. Hounds bounded about, eager for the chase. They rode out of the city through the King's Gate, heading for the Kingswood. Robert guided his stallion with a grim determination, ignoring the occasional wince of pain when the jolting aggravated his side. Ser Loras hung back slightly, watchful. He remembered with perfect clarity how the king's last hunt had nearly been his end. He would do everything in his power to ensure that no such calamity struck again. Ned rode beside Robert. "We should keep this brief," the Lord of Winterfell advised quietly, worry etched on his face. "Your body is not what it was." "I'm not a crone yet, Ned," Robert snapped, though not without a trace of affection. "I'm a man who nearly died, and now I'm taking life by the horns again. Or the tusks, if you like. I'll have a boar's head on a pike by sundown." Soon they dispersed into a looser formation, hounds sniffing and barking among the undergrowth. The Kingsguard fanned out in pairs. Loras felt a knot of anticipation in his chest. He glanced at Joffrey, whose arrogant smirk sat uneasy on the boy's features. Loras wondered if Joffrey was truly seeking to prove himself in front of his father, or if there was another reason he had insisted on coming. If rumors were to be believed, Joffrey might be more intrigued by cruelty than bravery, but Loras tried not to let those thoughts distract him. He needed his wits firmly about him. They had not gone far before the hounds picked up a scent. The group tensed, scanning the trees. Robert urged his horse forward, ignoring Ned's call to be cautious. The king's eyes gleamed with a fervor that worried Loras. There was a desperation in them, a need to reaffirm his own vigor. Before long, a small boar charged through the brush, squealing angrily. It was not nearly as large as the beast that had mauled Robert, but it was vicious enough to set the hounds howling. Robert kicked his horse into a gallop, spear at the ready. Loras quickly followed, barking orders to the other Kingsguard to form a perimeter. They had practiced this after seeing the king's insistence on a new hunt. If Robert was to do something foolish, they would at least be prepared to intervene. The boar skittered away, darting around trees. Robert hurled his spear, but pain likely spoiled his aim. The spear missed by a foot. Ned reined his horse, calling after Robert to slow down. But Robert would not heed him. With a savage cry, the king drew a hunting sword from his belt and urged his horse onward, determined to cut off the fleeing beast. Loras, his heart hammering, saw the boar twist and bolt, heading down a small ravine. Robert followed, oblivious to the steep drop. At once, Loras spurred his own horse, determined to intercept. The ground sloped down, and Robert's horse stumbled, nearly pitching the king forward. The boar, cornered by the ravine walls, turned with a snarl. Robert tensed, sword raised, but his posture wobbled in the saddle. In that instant, Loras urged his destrier between Robert and the boar. The animal charged, tusks scraping Loras's horse's flank, but he angled his shield just so, deflecting a more dangerous blow. He pivoted, slashing down with a deft stroke of his sword, piercing the boar's bristly hide. The beast squealed and collapsed. Robert watched, chest heaving, face pale. When the boar's squeals subsided, Loras turned to the king. "Your Grace," he said, breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" Robert shook his head, but pain etched his features. He held his sword arm close to his body, as if the jolt had pulled at his healing wound. Slowly, the rest of the hunting party converged. Ned arrived first, expression thunderous, then Joffrey, who gawked at the scene. "You fool!" Ned roared at Robert, forgetting all decorum in his fear for his friend's life. "You might have been killed again," Robert snarled, then softened at the real concern in Ned's eyes. "I had to prove I could do it," he muttered. "I had to prove that I'm still Robert Baratheon." Ned shook his head. "This is madness, Robert. You don't need to risk your life for that." Joffrey, still astride his horse, sneered. "Father, if you are so weakened, why chase boars at all? Let the knights handle it." The tone in the boy's voice was more mocking than concerned, and it did not escape Loras's notice. Robert glared at his son, but only said, "Mind your tongue, boy." Then, with a wince, he gestured to Loras. "Help me up the ravine. I'm done here." Loras dismounted, offering a steady arm to the king. Together, they navigated the steep slope back up to safer ground. Loras's horse bore a shallow gash on its flank, and the Knight of Flowers worried that the wound might fester if not tended. He consoled the trembling animal with gentle words, patting its neck. Robert's own mount looked spooked, eyes rolling, but no worse for wear. The king's pride, however, had taken another blow. It was plain in the grim set of his jaw. By sunset, they returned to the Red Keep with less fanfare than Robert might have wanted. The boar was not a monstrous trophy, just a half-grown beast. Yet it would serve as proof that Robert still hunted. In private, Ned gave Robert a piece of his mind once more, arguing that the king's duty was to the realm, not to his own pride. Robert stormed off, refusing to listen further. Loras, meanwhile, inspected his horse's wound, applying a salve. He felt certain he had done the right thing, stepping in, but also felt a pang of sympathy for Barristan Selmy, who would have likely done the same if he were still Lord Commander. Cersei, upon hearing the news, refused to show Robert an ounce of sympathy. She only asked coldly, "Was the boar bigger than the last one?" It was an insult masked as a question. Robert had no answer, only a bruised sense of self. In the following weeks, the king's attention returned to the affairs of state. Urgent petitions from across the realm demanded his intervention. The Ironborn were restless. Rumors of raids near the stony shore circulated. The Vale had its own turmoil with Lisa Arryn's paranoid governance. Dorne quietly watched, as ever, waiting to see if the realm would tear itself apart. Robert found each new challenge both exhausting and invigorating. Part of him had slept for years while the Lannisters and others took the reins. He would sleep no more. One day, in a closed meeting of the small council, Robert made a fateful announcement. "We must reckon with our finances. Gold is the lifeblood of any war, and we owe an ocean of coin to the Iron Bank. That ends now. I've ordered Stannis to return from Dragonstone to discuss new measures. The time has come for us to put the Realm's house in order." Littlefinger, leaning casually against a marble column, offered a small bow. "Your Grace, the crown's expenses are numerous, and your good father-in-law, Lord Tywin, has covered many of them in the past with loans. Perhaps we might—" "Enough!" Robert cut him off. "I'm done putting my balls in Tywin Lannister's hands. We'll pay what we owe and do it ourselves. If that means we cut feasts, cut gifts, cut every gaudy expense, so be it." Cersei's eyes flashed with disdain, but she held her tongue in the presence of the entire council. Grand Maester Pycelle cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable. Varys folded his hands and murmured, "A wise step, perhaps, to restore the realm's coffers. Yet it must be done carefully, lest the small folk suffer unduly." Robert fixed Varys with a hard stare. We'll see who suffers. Now, are there any other matters that can't wait? Varys's expression was unreadable. Just one, your grace. There is word from the north. The wildlings stir beyond the wall. Your warden of the north, Lord Stark, might wish to address it. All eyes turned to Ned. He looked gravely at Robert. I've had ravens from Castle Black. A large host of wildlings appears to be gathering. The Night's Watch requests more men, more supplies, to fortify the wall. They fear a large-scale incursion. Robert rubbed his brow. Wildlings? They're always rattling about. Are they truly a threat? Ned's voice was quiet, firm. I believe they might be. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, unites them. We should listen to the warnings, Robert. Robert grunted. Fine. We'll send some additional forces if we can spare them. And supplies. We can't have the north overrun. He drummed his fingers on the table, mind clearly swirling with the many issues at hand. After the meeting concluded, Ned lingered. He had not spoken to Robert at length since the ill-fated hunt. Now he approached with his brow furrowed. Robert, these are all good steps, but be wary. Every time you try to stand on your own feet, the Lannisters will see it as an affront. They'll not sit idle. Are you ready for that fight? Robert snorted. I won a rebellion against Aerys Targaryen. I can handle the Lannisters. But his voice held a sliver of doubt, and Ned heard it. Cersei's reaction to these changes was slow in coming. She had chosen to endure her husband's temper for a while, letting him believe he was free from her manipulations. But every day that passed saw more modifications. Loras Tyrell commanding the Kingsguard, the king auditing the treasury, Ned Stark increasingly present at Robert's side. It all reeked of a coordinated effort to diminish the Lannisters' power. So, quietly, she began to make her own moves. Jaime Lannister started receiving cryptic orders from his sister. He was to watch Loras Tyrell closely, to find weaknesses in the boy. He was to sow mistrust if the opportunity arose. Meanwhile, spies were dispatched to Highgarden, collecting tidbits of gossip that might harm the Tyrells standing with the king. Cersei knew that while Robert put on a grand show of defiance, his vices remained. She could still exploit them if she was subtle enough. Within the Red Keep, Loras found that the hardest part of his new position was dealing with the existing Kingsguard knights. Barristan Selmy's presence loomed like a silent reproach. He was courteous, obeying orders without protest, but his cold reserve spoke volumes. Jaime Lannister showed open disdain, rarely responding to Loras with anything more than a mocking smirk. Meryn Trant and Boros Blunt were little more than brutes in white cloaks, but they were loyal to the crown's gold, not necessarily to Loras. Only Aerys Oakhart and Preston Greenfield seemed sympathetic. One afternoon, Loras summoned all of them to the White Sword Tower to hold a meeting in the chamber of the Kingsguard. He wanted to set a tone of unity. The table there was round, the walls adorned with the histories of the Kingsguard, and the chairs were set equally. But upon entering, Loras felt the chill. Jaime lounged in his seat, arms crossed, a sneer dancing on his lips. Barristan stood ramrod straight, refusing to sit at first. Thank you for coming, Loras began, trying to adopt a calm, commanding tone. I realize changes have been abrupt, and that I am the youngest among you. But we have one duty, to protect the king and the royal family. Whatever personal feelings we hold, they must be set aside. Jaime gave a short laugh. Personal feelings, of course. He tilted his head. Do you have any notion how many battles Ser Barristan has fought? How many times he's saved a king's life with his sword? And you think a single speech will restore order to a gutted tradition? Loras drew a slow breath. Ser Jaime, I understand your loyalty to Ser Barristan. My appointment does not negate his service. Indeed, if Ser Barristan has any counsel for me, I will gladly hear it. He turned to Barristan, who at last inclined his head slightly. I have only this counsel, Lord Commander, Barristan said, his tone clipped. Uphold the vows of the Kingsguard. Serve the king with honor. If you do that, I've no quarrel with you. Loras gave a nod, relief flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Ser Barristan." Jaime rolled his eyes, and the meeting continued, though little was resolved beyond perfunctory assignments for guarding the king's quarters and the queen's. When the knights dispersed, Loras felt a deep weariness. This was not what he had imagined when dreaming of joining the Kingsguard as a boy. The lofty ideal of a brotherhood of knights, pure and faithful to their vows, was nowhere in sight. Instead, he found political rivalries and scorn. But he would not yield. That evening, Margaery Tyrell arrived in King's Landing, escorted by a small retinue of Tyrell men. Loras's beloved sister, rumored to be as clever as she was beautiful, stepped onto the cobblestones of the Red Keep's courtyard with an air of quiet poise. Word spread quickly that Mace Tyrell might be maneuvering for a royal match, perhaps to wed Margaery to Joffrey if Cersei's influence waned. Or, if Robert set aside Cersei, a rumor that circulated in hushed corners, Margaery might even become the king's bride. Such talk made Loras uneasy, but he accepted that House Tyrell would not waste this opportunity to increase their power. Robert, for his part, showed Margaery a courteous welcome, though he did not drool over her beauty as some might have expected. He was still grappling with his own sense of purpose, and the idea of discarding his queen, though tempting, was not a simple matter. Besides, something in Robert still clung to the memory of Lyanna Stark, whose absence had shaped his entire reign in ways he was only beginning to understand. Cersei greeted Margaery with a frosty politeness, the two women exchanging veiled barbs. The queen saw in Margaery not a mere girl but a potential replacement, a threat to her son's claim, indeed to everything the Lannisters had worked for. On the surface there were civil words. Beneath, poison brewed. Tension mounted further when Stannis Baratheon arrived from Dragonstone. He arrived quietly in the early dawn, with only a few loyal men. The king's solemn elder brother carried an air of grim determination, matched only by Ned Stark's stoicism. Many in King's Landing had never warmed to Stannis, finding him humorless and severe. But Robert needed him now. Behind closed doors, the brothers met, accompanied only by Ned Stark and Loras, who stood guard. Stannis had a ledger in hand, records of shipping in the Narrow Sea, and a stack of letters from the Iron Bank of Bravos. He wasted no time in explaining that the realm was in dire peril financially, that the debts must be repaid if war was to be avoided. Robert paced the room, halting to gulp occasional sips of watered wine. "How do we pay them, Stannis?" Robert demanded, frustrated. "We have nothing left in the treasury. We have enough to feed the court for a year, maybe two." Stannis's jaw tightened. "We tighten our belts. We raise new taxes. Or we take out new loans at extortionate rates, which will only lead to future ruin. The realm is on the brink, Robert." Ned's face was grave. "If we must reduce the size of the royal household to pay for the realm's defense, so be it. The alternative is to remain under Tywin Lannister's thumb or to risk the Iron Bank funding our enemies if we default." Robert growled, fists clenched. For a moment he turned his gaze to Loras. "What do you think, Lord Commander? The Tyrells have money. Will your father help if I ask him for a loan, to sever our dependence on the Lannisters?" Loras hesitated. It was a delicate question. "My Lord Father has long wanted closer ties with the crown. I believe he would help, yes, but he would desire favors in return. Perhaps a betrothal or certain titles." Stannis's lips curled in distaste. "We exchange one family's stranglehold for another's, then. Better to find a path that does not rely on any single house, or will only set ourselves up for another dance of debts." Ned nodded in agreement. "We must be balanced in all things. We can ask each great house for assistance, a partial loan, so that none holds the lion's share of the debt. Meanwhile, new trade routes might be open to Essos to bolster the crown's income. But it will take time. Years." Robert looked at Stannis, then Ned, and then let his gaze fall on Loras, who stood with a respectful vigilance. "I'll see about it. We'll do what we must. But I'll not beg." Stannis, in his typically blunt manner, said, "Begging may be preferable to war, Robert. The realm cannot afford another war. Not now." The king's glare was fierce, yet he did not shout. Instead, he sank into a chair, pressing a hand to his still tender side. "Fine. Draw up your proposals, Stannis. I'll review them. That's all for now." When Stannis left, along with Ned Stark, Loras remained behind, standing silently by the door. Robert exhaled heavily, beckoning him closer. "Speak plainly, boy. You said your father would want a betrothal. Would that be to Joffrey? Or to me?" The question hung in the air, charged and uncomfortable. Loras hesitated, his loyalty divided. "I cannot say for certain, Your Grace. My father sees advantage in every arrangement. Marjorie is of age to wed Joffrey, or she could wed your brother Renly, or, in theory, if you set aside the queen, she could wed you. My father would weigh each possibility." Robert snorted. "Marriage alliances. I hate the lot of them, but I suppose that's how the game is played." He looked past Loras out the window at the city below. "You know, I never got the chance to marry the one I truly wanted. The realm forced me down a path, and I took it without question. I was a good soldier, Loras. I fought, I won, and then I sat a throne I never thought I'd occupy. But I'm changing that now. I'll rule as I see fit. If that means forging a new marriage, so be it. I won't let the Lannisters dictate my every breath." Loras inclined his head. He felt a pang of pity for the king, who was caught between duty and desire, memory and ambition. "If I may speak freely, Your Grace, Marjorie is beloved by many. She is charitable, kind, and clever. But she is also a Tyrell, and that means my grandmother and father will have opinions. Do not think to rule her the way you might rule a lesser lady." Robert gave a rasping laugh. "I've never ruled any woman. That's the truth of it. At best, I've avoided them." He waved a hand. "Well, let's see how things go. Send word to your father that I'm open to negotiations about a loan and a potential betrothal. But no promises yet." So began a precarious courtship between the crown and House Tyrell. Cersei, alerted to the possibility of Marjorie becoming queen, spiraled into a simmering rage. In her bedchamber, she smashed a priceless Myrish vase, screeching curses that echoed through the halls. Jaime tried to soothe her, telling her that Robert was bluffing, that he was merely using the Tyrells as leverage against the Lannisters. But Cersei was no fool. She could sense that the tide was turning and that her father would not allow House Lannister to lose its grip on the throne so easily. With the departure of that embassy, King's Landing seemed to hold its breath. Loras Tyrell remained at the king's side, knowing that any major shift in alliances could spark violence. The City Watch was kept on high alert, and tensions with the Lannister Guard stationed in the Red Keep rose. Whispers multiplied that if Tywin refused a compromise, Robert might forcibly remove Cersei from her position as queen, or worse, call for open war on the west. In the midst of this, Marjorie Tyrell began making subtle moves of her own. She rode through the city's streets, distributing bread to the poor, smiling graciously at ragged children. She hosted small gatherings in the keep, inviting noble ladies to discuss charitable works. In a short time, she garnered the admiration of many who saw her as a beacon of hope in a court stifled by tension and fear. Ser Loras found pride in his sister's actions, though he also worried she might be painting a target on her back for Cersei's wrath. Robert observed these doings with a mix of curiosity and approval. It pleased him to see someone genuinely care for the small folk, and it reminded him of what a queen could be. Occasionally, he would ask Loras about Marjorie's background, how she had been raised, what she believed in. Loras would answer honestly, highlighting her intelligence, her compassion, and her capacity for adaptation. All the while, the king's more pressing concerns remained. The realm's coffers, the threat of a Lannister backlash, the restless Iron Islands, and the stirring wildlings beyond the wall. Each new day brought fresh messages from the corners of the realm, each reminding him that a king's trials were never done. Yet Robert persevered, forging alliances where he could, leaning on Ned's counsel, Stannis' thoroughness, and Loras's loyalty. As the weeks stretched on, the day came when the envoy to Harrenhal returned. Ned Stark arrived tired but upright, face drawn. Stannis looked more grim than usual, if that were even possible. Littlefinger wore a thin smile, though his eyes suggested frustration. Robert convened them immediately in the council chamber, ignoring his own fatigue. Ned spoke first. Lord Tywin is willing to reduce the interest on the loans we owe him, but in exchange, he demands that Ser Loras Tyrell be removed as Lord Commander. He sees it as a public insult to House Lannister. He also requests that Joffrey be betrothed to Myrcella's cousin from Lannisport, a means of consolidating Lannister influence. Robert stared at Ned. He wants me to remove Loras and betroth my son to some Lannister girl. Yes, Ned said gravely. He claims that your appointment of Loras Tyrell was a direct affront to Jaime Lannister's place and to Ser Barristan Selmy's honor. He calls it a slight that must be remedied before he'll consider better terms on the loans. Robert's fists clenched. I'll not bow to that old lion. I don't care how large his gold hoard is. Stannis nodded in agreement. If we yield to Tywin on this, we might as well crown him king. He'll only demand more in the future. Littlefinger interjected in a smooth tone. Yet if we do not yield, we may face the entire might of House Lannister. They could close their purses and force us into deeper debt with the Iron Bank. Or worse, they might march. The realm could be plunged into chaos. Ned scowled at Littlefinger. Better war than servitude. Is that what you're saying? War is a terrible thing, Peter. Littlefinger shrugged. Yes, but a slow strangling by debts can be equally terrible. We must consider all angles. Robert stood abruptly, ignoring the pain that flared in his side. I won't remove Loras. He's my Lord Commander, and that's final. As for Joffrey's betrothal, I'll consider a match with Margaery Tyrell if it comes to that. Or perhaps Myrcella to Tommen to strengthen ties to the Tyrells. But not one more child of mine will be traded like a coin to buy the Lannisters' favor. This is my decree. Cersei was conspicuously absent, for Robert had chosen not to include her in these discussions. But word would get back to her soon enough. Ned pressed his lips together, gazing at Robert with a mixture of loyalty and apprehension. Then war may be on the horizon, Robert. Robert's voice was low, determined. So be it. If Tywin wants a fight, I'll give him one. But I suspect he'll not risk an open confrontation unless he believes he can catch us off guard. We'll prepare. Summon the banners in the Crownlands to muster quietly. Ensure the city watch is bolstered. Let Loras have the Kingsguard prepared at all hours. And send word to Renly in the Stormlands. I'll want his knights ready as well. Stannis nodded, though a shadow passed over his face. And the Tyrells? Robert looked at Loras. If your father is to stand with me, this is the time to prove it. Send him a raven. Tell him what's transpired. If he commits Highgarden's forces, Tywin will think twice before marching. Loras inclined his head, though apprehension tugged at him. House Tyrell was vast in power, but Mace Tyrell was not known for decisive action unless it benefited him. The possibility of placing Margaery on the throne as queen might be enough to lure him into direct confrontation with House Lannister, but would it be enough to actually fight a war for Robert if it came to that? Events moved swiftly. In the days that followed, the Red Keep buzzed with preparations both open and clandestine. Knights were discreetly summoned. Lannister men in the Red Keep received coded letters from their lord, instructing them to keep watch and wait. Ser Jaime Lannister, seeing the writing on the wall, confronted Loras Tyrell in the practice yard one morning, swords in hand. They sparred for nearly an hour. Jaime's skill was undeniable, honed by years of battle and training. Loras, though younger and less experienced in real wars, displayed a dazzling speed and precision that kept Jaime on his toes. The clang of steel on steel drew a crowd. By the end, both knights were breathing hard, sweat pouring. A final flurry from Loras forced Jaime to step back abruptly, and the Kingsguard parted them. Jaime smirked, wiping his brow. You're better than I expected, Lord Commander. Still, not quite at my level. Loras returned the smirk, though he felt the ache in his arms. That's what you say now. Perhaps we'll have a rematch soon. Jaime's voice grew icy. Perhaps, Watch your back, Ser Loras. You might wear a white cloak, but don't think that makes you invincible." And then he walked off, leaving the threat hanging in the humid morning air. Loras knew that steel might not be Jaime's best weapon. Cunning and betrayal might serve him better if it came to a true conflict. His only solace was that Robert, Ned, and even Stannis seemed firm in their support. Yet a creeping thought nagged at him. The king was a man of impulses, and impulses could change. A new wave of tension seized the court when a raven arrived bearing ominous tidings from the north. The wildlings had begun crossing the wall in small bands, clashing with the Night's Watch Rangers. If the rumors were true, Mance Rayder's host was not far behind. Winter was coming, the words of House Stark intoned. But war in the south threatened to overshadow the threat in the north. Ned Stark was torn. His sense of duty pulled him northward to secure his lands. But he could not abandon Robert now, not when the king's position was so precarious. He urged the king to dispatch additional forces to the north, but Robert hesitated, unwilling to weaken the Crownlands or the potential front against the Lannisters. It was a choice that gnawed at Ned's conscience. Through all of this, Robert held to his vow to keep Loras as Lord Commander. He also quietly began to see more of Marjorie Tyrell in social settings, observing how she interacted with courtiers, how gracefully she navigated the swirl of politics. Though the king's personal passions were once inflamed by whores, fights, and hunts, now his interest was more complex. He wanted a partner who might help him stand against the Lannisters, someone the people might love. Marjorie had a knack for winning hearts. In her chambers, Cersei seethed more with each passing day. Conversations with Jaime turned more and more bitter. She threatened to leave King's Landing, threatened to return to Casterly Rock, threatened even to have Marjorie killed if she dared set foot in the throne room as anything more than a visitor. Yet for all her rage, she did nothing overt. Tywin's instructions from Harrenhal had been for her to maintain appearances until he gave word to act. If he decided war was the only option, the time would come soon enough. Winter approached. The skies grew bleaker. Ravens croaked from the battlements of the Red Keep, and chill winds swept the city. In the yard, the king's men drilled daily, forging new swords, mending old armor. Loras Tyrell oversaw much of this personally, ensuring the Kingsguard was in prime condition, both in skill and morale. He had never expected to lead men in war, at least not as Lord Commander to a king who hovered on the precipice of conflict. Yet here he was, forging alliances with guardsmen, earning their loyalty. Some responded to his natural charm. Others respected his skill with the sword. Even Ser Barristan began to offer the occasional word of advice, though always in private. One evening, Barristan approached him in the White Sword Tower. Loras stood by a narrow window, gazing at the flickering lights of the city. Barristan cleared his throat, and when Loras turned, the old knight handed him a small battered book. "These are my notes," Barristan said gruffly. "Records of how we allocated guard shifts, rosters, protocols for emergencies. All from the reign of King Aerys to now. They may be of use to you." Loras was taken aback by the gesture. "Thank you, Ser Barristan. Your counsel is invaluable." Barristan's stern face softened. "I cannot say I approve of how the king replaced me. But if you wear the white cloak, I will treat you as a brother in arms. May we both serve the realm faithfully." For a moment, gratitude welled in Loras's chest. "We will, Ser Barristan. We must." Outside, the threat of war loomed closer with each passing day. Messengers rode in and out. Whispers filled taverns and back alleys. Some said the Lannisters had quietly begun mustering in the west, that Jaime's departure from King's Landing was imminent. Others claimed Tywin had secured alliances with the Freys of the twins, or that the Ironborn might join in if paid enough. Every rumor fueled anxiety in the city, and the king's attempt to reassert authority sparked the question. Would the realm descend into chaos once more? Still, Robert refused to yield. "I survived that damned boar," he would say to his closest advisors. "I'll survive this too." And there was a light in his eyes that many had not seen in years, a determination that might propel the Seven Kingdoms to a new horizon, or plunge them into the darkest conflict since Robert's rebellion. As winter's chill deepened, King Robert Baratheon, accompanied by his loyal Lord Commander Loras Tyrell, faced the uncertain dawn of a realm on the brink. The roads ahead diverged. One path led to a precarious peace carved out by alliances and careful negotiations, the other to a war that might shatter the fragile order of the Seven Kingdoms. Standing in the great hall, dwarfed by the Iron Throne, Robert lifted his gaze to the swords of conquered enemies that had been melted into the twisted steel seat. Once, his victory was assured by the might of his hammer and the rallying of loyal lords. Now, the game was more subtle, the battlefield filled with whispers and gold, not just swords and blood. Yet standing behind him, Lord Commander Loras Tyrell held a silent promise in his heart. He would defend this king against all foes, external or within, to protect the realm and the future of House Tyrell. For the first time in many moons, Robert Baratheon felt a stirring of hope, a sense that, perhaps, he was no longer alone in bearing the burden of the crown. In that moment, with the wind howling beyond the thick walls of the Red Keep and the uncertain fate of the Seven Kingdoms looming, the king reached a steady hand back and clasped Loras's shoulder. "Let them come," Robert said, voice low but resolute. "We'll show them what it means to stand against the fury of the storm." And Loras, with all the conviction of his youth and the weight of his vow, nodded. The future was dark and full of terrors, but for once, Robert Baratheon did not face it alone. Robert Baratheon could feel the chill of the coming winter clawing at his bones whenever he stood in the courtyard of the Red Keep these days. It was not only the change of season, nor merely the wind off Blackwater Bay, that pricked his skin. It was the tension in the air, the sense that all of Westeros stood on the edge of a knife. He was a man who had once soared as high as any in the realm, victorious after Robert's rebellion, beloved for a time. But the years since had cast a film over his glory, a haze of endless feasting and drinking, of pointless hunts and whoring. Even now, after surviving the boar's tusk that should have slain him, the king had to fight off the urge to pour himself a flagon of heady wine and drown his thoughts. Yet he resisted. He kept to watered wine. His every step in the castle came with a twinge in his healing side, a pain that refused to fade, reminding him of his mortality. That pain was what kept him honest. Whenever he was tempted to slump back into old habits, he felt the scar in his flesh burn hot, and it fired his will anew. He would not be a fool again. He had been a fool for too long. He rose early these days, something the old Robert Baratheon would have considered an affront to pleasure. At dawn, the first light in the sky tinging the horizon pink, he would walk the battlements, ignoring the protests of Maester Pycelle. With him walked Ser Loras Tyrell, sworn to guard him, clad in the white cloak of Lord Commander. Behind them trailed a handful of other Kingsguard, Baratheon the Bold, silent as a statue but ever watchful, Aerys Oakheart, eager to prove his loyalty, Meryn Trant and Boros Blunt, their presence a sullen afterthought. If Jaime Lannister was on duty, he often chose that moment to take his leave, preferring not to walk in the cool air with Robert and his new Lord Commander. The Lion did not like being overshadowed. As Robert peered at the city below, he thought of the rumors swirling through King's Landing, that Tywin Lannister was mustering his armies at Casterly Rock, that the Westerlands might soon march south and east, in defiance of the king's newly minted alliances. That war could erupt before the new year turned. Robert's nights were restless with dreams of battles from long ago, of the hammer of the trident crashing down on Rhaegar Targaryen's breastplate, of the bells at the ford ringing in frantic echoes. Only now, in his dreams, he sometimes saw Tywin Lannister's pale green eyes in Rhaegar's place, or else the golden curls of Jaime, or the glittering mane of Cersei. His foes blurred, shifting shape in the shadows. Still, he pressed on. The realm needed him. He clutched the hope of forging a safer tomorrow, one where his rule was not just a drunken farce propped up by Lannister gold. He had Stannis, austere and unyielding, at his back. He had Ned Stark, that quiet pillar of honor, though Ned's eyes gleamed with worry for the north. And he had Loras Tyrell, a symbol of new blood and the promise of Tyrell support. Robert loathed the complicated arrangements needed to keep the realm together, the game of marriage and negotiation, But at least he was playing now instead of letting everyone else shuffle him like a piece on a sivas board. One morning, during their walk atop the battlements, Robert stopped and rested his arms on the stone. Below, the city shimmered with the morning's first stirrings. Fishmongers hauling their catches, street urchins scrambling for coin, the faithful passing into the septs, whispering prayers for deliverance from the storms that might blow in from the sea. Ser Loras halted beside him, posture impeccably straight. The young knight's breath formed faint wisps in the cool air. "Ser Loras," Robert said, his voice echoing over the ramparts. "How fare the men this morning?" "They are well, your grace. The city watch stands at triple the usual number on the gates, as ordered. Captain Jacelyn Bywater reported no disturbances in the night." Robert nodded. "And the King's Guard?" "We are at full strength, your grace." Loras's voice held a quiet confidence. Ser Baratheon supervised the perimeter watches. Ser Jaime remains cooperative, as far as duty is concerned. Robert barked a short laugh. "Cooperative is one word for it. I can feel his hatred every time I so much as glance at him. He must yearn to split my skull and be done with it." Loras's expression tightened at the disrespectful notion. He would not dare break his vows so openly. Wouldn't he? Robert's grin was mirthless. "He slew his king once, though that king was mad. Then again, perhaps I'm halfway to madness in his eyes." He allowed a short exhale, letting the tension diffuse. "If he tries anything, you'll be ready." "I will," Loras said. "I've arranged the guard schedules to ensure that Jaime is never alone on duty near you or the royal family. If he seeks trouble, he won't have an easy chance." "Good." Robert offered a small nod. He cast his gaze westward, where the sun had not yet fully embraced the horizon. Beyond those distant hills and fields lay the Stormlands, his ancestral home, and then further still the Westerlands. "If Tywin marches, we'll need every sword. Highgarden, Storm's End, the Reach and the Crownlands. Maybe the Vale if they'll leave that windy nest of theirs. The Lords of the North could come, if Ned calls them, but the North is vast and they've their own troubles. They say the Vale remains firmly under Lady Lisa Arryn, and she is hesitant to involve herself," Loras ventured. "And the North has more than just a few wildlings to worry about, from what I've heard." Robert grunted. "Everything's in flux, boy. I can feel it." He winced as a spike of pain lanced through his side. Still healing, though he'd put the Boar's attack behind him in mind and spirit. "Come, we've a long day ahead." They descended from the ramparts to the interior corridors, where torches still guttered in iron sconces. The Red Keep seemed quieter in these early hours, but pockets of activity were scattered throughout. Servants bustled, carrying trays of bread and fruit to break the fast. Pages scurried with letters. Kitchen boys lugged water for the scullions. Robert inhaled the smell of baking bread and found himself surprisingly hungry. He realized that not too long ago, a morning like this would have brought him only thirst for wine and a throbbing headache from the night before. They reached the King's Solar, where Ned Stark was waiting, along with Grand Maester Pycelle. The old man fussed with some scrolls, while Ned leaned over a map on the table. At their entry, both men bowed. Robert waved them to straighten. "Any news?" Robert asked. Ned tapped a point on the map. "We've had word from the Riverlands. Lord Hoster Tully's health fails. Edmure Tully is de facto in charge. It seems he's uneasy about the potential conflict between you and Lord Tywin. The Tullys have no love for the Lannisters, but Edmure is wary, especially with rumors of fresh Sellswords crossing the narrow sea. If Tywin is hiring them, the Riverlands could be the first battlefield." Robert's brow darkened. "Sellswords. Tywin might do that, especially if he expects me to be strapped for coin." "Damn the man." Ned nodded. "Edmure might side with us if we can promise him protection. But if we cannot show strength, he may stay neutral. He doesn't want a repeat of the War of the Five Kings that never was." Robert didn't miss Ned's subtle reference to the rebellions that had nearly broken out years ago. "We'll send him word of our intentions. We're not out to loot or ravage. We only seek to keep the throne free from Lannister gold chains." His gaze slid to Pycelle, who wore an expression of careful neutrality. "What about the Tyrells, Pycelle? Any messages from Highgarden?" Lord Tyrell's last raven indicated he musters men, though quietly, the maester said in his quavering voice. "He claims to be acting in accordance with your agreement, should the Lannisters make any provocative move. But he also requests certain concessions." Pycelle paused, adjusting his chain. "He asks that if war does break out, he be granted nominal leadership of the Reach, unchallenged, and that a Tyrell bride be seated beside the throne." Robert let out a heavy breath. "He wants Marjorie as queen or Joffrey's betrothed, in writing before he fully commits." "Humph." Ned's jaw set. "It is understandable he wants surety. War is risky, and House Tyrell will not act out of pure charity." "I know that," Robert muttered. "We're all players in this game. But to tie my son's future or my own so explicitly to House Tyrell." He glanced at Loras, remembering the young knight's caution that House Tyrell was as cunning in its own way as the Lannisters. "I'll think on it. For now, we must not appear desperate." Pycelle offered a bow. "As you say, Your Grace." "We're done here," Robert declared, ignoring Pycelle's half-formed protest. "Ned, you and Loras meet me in the practice yard at midday. I want to see the men drill." He left without waiting for an answer, Loras at his side. Ned watched them go, an uneasy feeling gathering in his chest, but he followed in short order, the king's will guiding them all. The morning wore on, filled with brief audiences in the throne room. Petty lords and merchants came forward, some complaining about taxes, others about bandits on the roads. Robert sat the Iron Throne with a stoic face, though the twisted sword still dug into his back. From that vantage, he could see Loras and Baratheon posted to either side of the dais, white cloaks striking. The hall was not overly full, but word had spread that the king was taking a more hands-on role, so a few curious courtiers hovered near the columns, eager for gossip. By midday, Robert had heard enough trifles. He rose from the throne, nodded curtly to the petitioners, and departed for the practice yard. The sun had climbed high, and the yard echoed with the crash of steel on steel. Squires and knights sparred under the watchful eyes of veteran men-at-arms, the ring of metal filling the air. Loras strode ahead, greeting some of the men, offering pointers. Baratheon joined them, and Robert was keenly aware of the tension between the old knight and the young. Yet they managed a truce of sorts, bound by duty. There was no time for petty disputes. Ned arrived shortly, wearing a light leather jerkin. "We've had the word sent to Lord Edmure. I told him we'd not stand aside if Tywin makes a move. Now it's up to Edmure whether to stand with us." Robert grunted his acknowledgement, but his gaze was on the men drilling. He moved among them, occasionally bellowing out an old soldier's tip or pointing out a flaw in stance. These men seemed surprised to see the king so engaged. Once, Robert would have been in the yard only to watch, half-drunk, or to amuse himself by ridiculing the lesser swordsman. Now he walked among them, remembering his days as a warrior. He might not have the same speed or stamina, but the hunger for battle flickered in his eyes. Some of the men found that heartening. He saw the hound there, Sandor Clegane, standing apart under the shade of a wall, arms folded. The tall, scarred man offered a short nod when Robert caught his eye. The king remembered that the hound often served as Joffrey's personal protector. For a moment, Robert considered approaching him, asking about Joffrey's behavior or state of mind, but the stormy expression on Clegane's face deterred him. That was not a conversation for the practice yard. He watched as Loras and Jaime Lannister ended a sparring session. Their swords whirled in arcs, too fast for most to track. Jaime's golden hair flashed each time he turned, and Loras's face was set in intense concentration. The clang of their blades resonated until Baratheon, officiating the match, called a halt. It looked even enough, though Robert suspected Jaime had wanted to humiliate the new Lord Commander. In the end, both parted with breathless half-bows, tension thick between them. Jaime shot Robert a cool glance, wiped the sweat from his brow, and offered a sardonic salute before stepping away. As the day wound down, Robert returned to his chambers to ready himself for a small feast that evening. Marjorie Tyrell had arranged it, an intimate gathering of lords and ladies who supported the king's aims or who might be swayed to do so. Robert understood Marjorie was forging alliances in her own manner, charming those who might otherwise gravitate to the Lannisters. He was grateful for her efforts, if cautious. She did nothing without an eye on the future. House Tyrell was planting seeds in every corner. He dressed without calling for a squire, ignoring the twinges of pain when he lifted his arms. The man in the polished metal mirror was older than the warrior who had bested Rhaegar Targaryen, but the new energy in his eyes was unmistakable. He ran a hand through his dark hair, shot with hints of gray. He would never be young again, but he might still carve out a worthy legacy. By the time he arrived at the smaller banquet hall, a group of about 30 lords and ladies had assembled, among them Marjorie, smiling graciously, wearing a gown of green that flattered her figure. A handful of Stormland lords who had answered the king's summons stood on one side, sipping spiced wine. A few prominent men from the Reach, cousins and bannermen to House Tyrell, mingled with them. Robert saw no Lannisters present, unsurprisingly. This was a gathering of the king's potential loyalists. Cersei was absent. She had refused to attend, claiming a headache. Robert did not lament that. He made his entrance with a surly flourish, accompanied by Loras and Aerys Oakhart, both wearing the white cloaks. At once, Marjorie stepped forward, curtsying. "Your Grace," she said in a demure yet confident tone. "We are honored by your presence." Robert offered a curt nod in return. "Lady Marjorie, I trust all is prepared." "It is indeed, Your Grace. Please, let us be seated. The cooks have worked tirelessly on the meal." She led him to the high table. Robert's eyes wandered over the guests, ensuring that no suspicious face lurked among them. He felt a momentary pang. Once upon a time, he would have reveled in the promise of rich meats, heady wine, and the flirtations of beautiful women. Tonight, caution reined him in. They dined on roast duck, crusty bread, honeyed carrots, and spiced pears. Robert drank only sparingly, aware that every eye watched him, measuring how much wine he consumed. Marjorie played the perfect hostess, laughing at minor jests from the Stormlords, inquiring after the harvest in the Reach, praising the crafts of various ladies. She spent a good portion of the meal in polite conversation with Robert, asking about the legacy of House Baratheon, inquiring after stories of the rebellion. Robert found himself unexpectedly at ease in her presence, though he guarded his words carefully. Marjorie was no naive girl. Each question she asked had a purpose. Perhaps she was gauging how soon the realm might be rid of Cersei, or how strongly Robert might commit to forging a permanent bond with Highgarden. "My grandmother sends her regards, Your Grace," Marjorie said at one point, leaning close enough that her floral perfume teased his senses. "She laments that her health prevents a long journey to King's Landing, but she stands steadfastly behind House Tyrell's oath to the crown. Her only wish is that we might formalize that arrangement soon." Robert listened, swirling his watered wine in the goblet. "No doubt you speak of marriage, or at least a betrothal." Marjorie gave a polite smile. "Perhaps, if the crown desires it." Robert watched the flicker of candlelight on her auburn-brown hair. Her eyes were bright, intent, but never openly demanding. "I've been considering it, but the realm's situation is more delicate than any of us like. If war comes, I can't guarantee I won't need to march on the Lannisters. That is no time to be forging a new wedding, is it?" Her smile softened. "Sometimes, Your Grace, a wedding can be exactly the statement needed to show unity and strength. But I will not presume to press you. My father is the one more inclined to demands." Robert snorted softly. "I've dealt with Mace Tyrell's demands before. He wants the world wrapped in a green cloak." Marjorie laughed, a silvery sound. "He does indeed. Still, for all his pomp, he will stand by you if it secures a Tyrell on the throne someday." Robert considered that. "And you, my lady? Would you stand by me if I did something drastic like set Cersei aside?" Or would you fear the scandal? She lowered her gaze in feigned modesty. I care for the well-being of the realm, your grace. If your cause is just, I would not flinch at scandal. But such matters are delicate and should be handled carefully. The High Septon might demand an annulment hearing. There could be outcry. Yet, if you are resolved, there are always ways. She met his eyes, letting him see her steadiness. He studied her for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of longing and caution. She was so young, so vibrant, and so entirely composed. He knew she was not naive. He also knew that forging a new marriage while Cersei lived under the same roof would be a declaration of war all on its own. Still, the possibility glimmered in his mind. Thank you for your candor, Lady Margaery. He sipped his wine. We shall see what tomorrow brings. She inclined her head demurely, then moved away to greet another guest. Robert watched her go, thoughts swirling. Across the hall, Loras Tyrell quietly observed his sister at the king's side, his features carefully schooled to neutrality. He knew Margaery's skill at courtly intrigue matched or exceeded his own prowess with a blade. The feast ended without incident, and Robert left early, claiming weariness. Loras accompanied him back to the royal chambers. On the way, Robert muttered, Your sister is clever. Do you think she truly wants this a marriage, or betrothal, or whichever arrangement your father seeks? Loras glanced at him. Margaery is a dutiful daughter, your grace. If it benefits the house, she will do it. But she's not without a will of her own. She believes in a better realm, truly, not just the pretense of one. Robert huffed a short breath. Better realm? A lofty dream, but perhaps it's worth fighting for. Then he clapped Loras's shoulder, surprising the young knight with the gesture of camaraderie. Keep an eye on her, though, and watch yourself. There are foes hidden everywhere, not just Lannisters. Loras acknowledged the warning. I will, your grace. They parted at the door to the king's rooms. Robert paused, looking down the long corridor, lit by flickering torches. At the far end, a figure stood Cersei, her hair a shining curtain of gold, her face partially obscured in shadow. Robert met her gaze from a distance, a silent confrontation. Then she turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Robert with a chill in his spine. That night, the king slept fitfully, plagued by half-formed nightmares of golden lions prowling the corridors, of boars that screamed in human voices. He woke before dawn, sweat-soaked, the taste of iron on his tongue. Standing by the open window, he let the cool air wash over him. Soon enough, he dressed and prepared for another day of kingship. The realm did not wait for a man's nightmares. It was at breakfast that the first ominous sign came. A messenger arrived, mud-splattered from hard riding, demanding audience with the king. Robert granted it in his solar, with Ned and Loras present. The messenger knelt, out of breath, and handed over a sealed parchment bearing the sigil of the Westerlands. The Golden Lion. Lord Tywin, the messenger began, sends his regards and a warning. He has heard troubling rumors that the crown conspires against him with Highgarden. He requests you cease any gathering of arms or alliances that threaten House Lannister's honor. If not, he will be forced to respond. Robert let out a bitter laugh. Forced to respond, is it? Did he specify how? The messenger swallowed. He said he will march if there is any further insult. Specifically, if any betrothal between your house and House Tyrell is announced, or if Jaime Lannister is removed from the Kingsguard. Ned stiffened. He's trying to dictate your every move, Robert. The king's eyes narrowed. Yes, he is. He turned to the messenger. Tell your lord that I do not take orders from him, and tell him if he marches on the crown, we will meet him in the field. Now go. The messenger nodded shakily and departed. For a moment, the solar was silent. Robert felt his heart pounding. He had expected Tywin to threaten, but seeing the words in black and white, hearing them repeated by a trembling courier, stirred up old anger. A line in the sand had been drawn. We cannot yield, Robert said firmly. I'll not let Tywin Lannister rule me through fear. Ned set a steady hand on his friend's shoulder. We won't yield, but be prepared for the cost. Robert glanced at Loras, whose face was grave. Send word to your father. Tell him Tywin means to strike if we formalize any betrothal. Let's see how the Tyrells respond. We need their swords if it comes to war. Loras bowed. At once, your grace. Ned's expression was somber as he left to see to the realm's defenses. Robert lingered in the solar, gazing out the narrow window at the city below. He could almost feel the pulse of the realm through the stone beneath his feet. The hour of decision was drawing near. That very afternoon, the Crown convened a war council in the castle's strategy room, a place seldom used in recent years, though it had once been the heart of planning during Robert's rebellion. The room was circular, dominated by a large table shaped roughly like the map of Westeros. Tiny carved figurines represented the major houses and armies. Dust had gathered on the corners, but servants had hastily swept and lit fresh candles. Robert was joined by Ned, Stannis, Loras, Renly, who had arrived in the capital just days before, and a handful of key advisors, including Littlefinger and Varys. Barristan Selmy stood guard, arms crossed over his pristine white armor. Stannis's face was carved from stone as he relayed intelligence. My ships patrol the waters near Dragonstone and Crackclaw Point. We have not seen any movement from the Westerland's navy, but it is small compared to ours. Tywin's power lies on land, with his knights and gold. Renly, wearing a flamboyant green doublet, ran a hand through his dark hair. My lords in the Stormlands stand ready if you call the banners, brother, he declared, though his tone was tinged with an eagerness that made Ned wary. Renly seemed almost excited by the prospect of war, or at least the political opportunities it might bring. Littlefinger leaned in, his fingers steepled. Summoning the banners is costly, your grace. The crown is already deeply in debt. Feeding thousands of soldiers, keeping them armed. Well, gold does not sprout from thin air. Robert glowered. If Tywin marches, we'll have no choice but to gather men. Let me worry about paying for it, Peter. Littlefinger offered a mocking half-bow. Of course, your grace. I am only your humble master of coin, offering caution. Ned studied the carved map, placing a wooden stag marker on King's Landing, a rose on Highgarden. If the Tyrells muster, they can bring tens of thousands of troops, enough to outnumber the Westerlands if combined with the Crownlands and Stormlands. The key question remains the Riverlands. If Edmure Tully joins us, Tywin would be nearly encircled. And if Tywin strikes the Riverlands first, Loras pointed out, he may force them into neutrality or submission before we can react. Stannis tapped the table. We should not let him. Let us move first. Strike him at the border or show enough force to dissuade him. Better to act than wait for him to choose the battlefield. Varys cleared his throat. May I remind the council that open war will leave the capital vulnerable to intrigues from within? There are still many Lannister men in the Red Keep. And the Queen. He paused with a thin smile. Let us not forget the Queen. At that, an uneasy silence settled. Everyone knew that Cersei was a factor none of them had fully reckoned with. She was cunning, ruthless. Ned recalled how she had once threatened him when he delved too deeply into the parentage of her children, back before Robert's brush with death had changed the course of events. Now, with Robert's resurgence and the Tyrell alliance overshadowing her, Cersei was more dangerous than ever. Finally, Robert spoke. We'll not sit idle. I want a show of strength. Send riders to the Crownlands lords. Have them muster a portion of their forces near Rosby, just enough to show Tywin we are not asleep. Stannis, see if you can coax a loan from the Iron Bank on better terms if possible. Ned, keep me apprised of the Riverlands. Renly, you'll handle communications with the Storm Lords. And Loras, he turned to the young Lord Commander. Double the guard on key areas of the Red Keep. Watch Cersei's corridors like hawks. If she or her brother so much as attempts to open a window the wrong way, I want to know. Loras nodded. It will be done. They broke apart. Robert lingered with Ned for a moment as the others trickled out. I wish it hadn't come to this, the king muttered. Ned's eyes were sympathetic, though his voice was steady. You gave Tywin every chance. He demands all or nothing. He'll not relent unless forced. Robert thought of the realm he had once championed, of the dream of freedom from the Mad King's tyranny, of peace for the small folk. Now the game threatened to tear it all apart once more. "Let him come, then," Robert said quietly. "We'll be ready." In the days that followed, the Red Keep became a hive of carefully managed chaos. Messages flew in and out. Armorers worked day and night, forging new blades and refitting old pieces of plate. The mustering at Rosby began in earnest, as small columns of Crownland knights gathered under the banner of the crowned stag. Reports came that Renly was calling up the Stormlords in a similar manner, though not all answered swiftly. Some claimed the roads were unsafe or that bandits roamed. Robert suspected some of them merely wanted to see if war was truly inevitable before committing. Meanwhile, Marjorie Tyrell's gatherings continued. She expanded them, inviting lords' wives and daughters, forging a network of influence among the women of the court. She donated coin to the septs to feed the poor, earning the faith's goodwill. More than once, she discreetly approached certain courtiers known to have Lannister sympathies, coaxing them to reconsider. All of this happened quietly, without fanfare, but Robert could see the impact. Whispers in the keep grew more favorable to House Tyrell. Some even joked that Marjorie was already a queen in all but name. And through it all, Cersei was silent. Too silent. She appeared at official functions only when required. She spoke little, though her green eyes flashed with resentment. Jaime Lannister continued his duties, giving Loras curt respect but no warmth. The air hummed with the potential for violence. One afternoon, Marjorie requested a private audience with Robert in the royal gardens. He granted it, meeting her among the trimmed hedges and rosebushes that were well tended, though not nearly as grand as Highgarden's rumored splendor. Loras stood a respectful distance away, with two of his sworn brothers to ensure no impropriety would stain the lady's reputation. "My lady," Robert greeted her with a polite nod. He wore a simple tunic without the heavy crown, aiming to appear at ease. "What matter brings you here?" She clasped her hands before her. "My father has written again, Your Grace. He strongly urges that a betrothal be announced soon, be it between me and Joffrey or some other arrangement. He believes it will seal the Tyrell commitment." Robert exhaled. "Your father plays a dangerous game, pressing for such an announcement when Tywin Lannister has threatened to march if we do so." She inclined her head. "Yes, but my father claims that Tywin will hesitate to begin a war if our alliance is set in stone. House Tyrell is numerous, wealthy, and can quickly outmatch the West if joined with the crown. The question is whether you are willing to risk Tywin's wrath preemptively." Robert paced a few steps along the hedge. "I'm risking that wrath regardless. The moment Tywin catches wind that the Tyrells are mustering, he might march. The real question is, do I publicly bind myself to your house?" He turned to her. "If it were Joffrey, you'd be his queen. How do you feel about that?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Joffrey is young. Perhaps he could be guided to wisdom, but I know he has a reputation for cruelty. I would do my utmost to temper that, for the sake of the realm." She paused delicately. "Yet I also know you and the queen are estranged. It is not unimaginable that the crown might be free of her claim in time." A ghost of a smile tugged at Robert's lips. "You speak plainly, my lady. Cersei's hold on that throne is weaker now than it was. But setting her aside would mean challenging the faith and likely the Lannisters outright. It would be a war in everything but name." Marjorie nodded. "I understand. My father's letter is quite explicit. Whether I wed you or your son, House Tyrell will stand behind you. But they want a formal promise." Robert felt the old anger surge in him. Anger at being cornered, at being forced to treat marriage like a hostage negotiation. But the boar's scar pulsed, reminding him that the realm demanded more than his pride. "Very well," he said at last, his voice grim. "Let me speak to Ned. If he agrees, we'll make the announcement in a few days that Joffrey and you are betrothed. I won't dethrone Cersei yet. That can come later if it must." Marjorie curtsied, expression unreadable. "I am at your service, Your Grace." She withdrew, and Robert stood among the roses, exhaling slowly. As soon as she was out of earshot, Loras stepped forward. "Your Grace, is there something you wish of me?" Robert shook his head. "Only your discretion, Sir Loras. I've made no final decision. But if I do betroth Joff to your sister, I expect you to ensure he does not harm her. The boy's a viper." Loras's voice tightened. "He will not dare. I will see to it personally." There was a flash of protectiveness in his eyes. With that, they parted. Robert returned to the keep, weighed down by the prospect of announcing his own son's betrothal for purely political reasons. Yet was that not the way of kings? His father had arranged his marriage to Cersei for the sake of unity after the rebellion, and look how that had turned out. Perhaps Joffrey and Margaery would be no better. But if it won him the swords of the Reach, it might save the realm from war, or at least from defeat. He found Ned Stark in the Great Hall, speaking quietly with Barristan Selmy about some minor matter of guard rotations. Robert signaled them to follow him to a secluded alcove behind a pillar of black marble, where the flicker of torchlight cast shifting shadows on their faces. "Barristan, guard this conversation," Robert commanded. The old knight bowed, stepping a few paces away to ensure their privacy. Robert turned to Ned. "Tyrell wants a betrothal, Joffrey to Margaery. He's pressing for it now, claims it will keep Tywin from marching." Ned folded his arms. "Will it? Or will it simply provoke Tywin to move sooner?" "I don't know," Robert admitted, frustration simmering in his tone. "Mace Tyrell says we either stand together openly, or we risk Tywin picking us off one by one. I'm inclined to think he's right, but I'd rather not see war tomorrow if I can help it." Ned gazed at the far end of the hall, where a tapestry depicted Aegon's conquest. "I don't trust Joffrey with a girl as good-hearted as Margaery. She deserves better." "So does the realm," Robert replied quietly. "But these are the cards we have. If Joffrey is betrothed, the Tyrell banners will flock to our side. We'll outnumber the Westerlands significantly. Perhaps Tywin will yield rather than face such odds." Ned nodded slowly. "Then do it, Robert. Make the announcement. But be ready for Cersei's wrath. She will see it as the final rejection of her and her house." Robert's lips curled in a bitter smirk. "She already knows. I can't hide any move in this damned castle. If she wants to burn it all down, we'll be ready." So the decision was made. Arrangements were set for a small ceremony in the royal sept 3 days hence, at which the betrothal would be formally announced and blessed by the High Septon's representative. Margaery was careful to keep the gathering to a modest size, to avoid flaunting the alliance in the faces of the Lannisters who still wandered the halls. Still, it was impossible to keep it secret. Word spread through the keep and then the city, igniting curiosity and speculation. The Tyrells had triumphed. The Lannisters had been supplanted. The king was severing ties with his old allies. War must be near. Cersei confronted Robert the night before the ceremony. She swept into his chambers without knocking, her emerald eyes flashing like wildfire. Robert stood near the fireplace, where coals glowed faintly, providing more warmth than light. 2 Kingsguard knights snapped to attention, uncertain whether to bar the queen's way, but Robert gestured them to stand aside. She advanced upon him, fury visible in the stiffness of her posture. Her voice was soft but dangerous. "You insult me and my father. You plot to marry our eldest son to a Tyrell girl without even asking me." "Joffrey is my son as well," Robert said, refusing to flinch under her glare. "And you've made it clear your first loyalty is to your house, not mine." "How dare you?" she hissed. "If you do this, Tywin will march, and half the realm will bleed." "That will be on your father's head," Robert retorted, his voice low. "He threatened me. He demanded I remove Loras and do his bidding. I will not." Cersei's face twisted with rage. For a moment, she looked capable of striking him, even if it meant the Kingsguard seizing her. But she merely spat out her next words. "You're a fool, Robert. You always have been. You think this is your triumph? The Tyrells will choke you just as thoroughly as my father would. And they'll smile while they do it." Robert's jaw clenched. I'll take that chance. She stepped closer, so close he could smell the faint perfume in her hair. You think you still hold power, but you're just a figurehead, a battered old stag with tattered antlers, waiting to be brought down. If the Tyrells don't do it, my father will. You should have died in that forest. His chest burned with sudden anger, but he refused to strike her, refused to give in to that old violence between them. Instead, he seized her arm in a harsh grip. Say what you like, Cersei. Tomorrow the betrothal is announced and you cannot stop it. If your father declares war, so be it. And if we survive, I'll see about annulling this sham of a marriage. She wrenched free of his grip, eyes glistening with hatred. Don't expect me to cower. I have alliances of my own. She stormed out, leaving Robert trembling. The Kingsguard knights exchanged tense looks but said nothing. Robert closed the door, hearing the echo of his wife's footsteps fade. For a long moment, he stood in silence, letting the flames in the hearth soothe him. His scar throbbed again, though whether from the memory of the boar's tusks or the wound in his soul left by his empty marriage, he could not say. Morning dawned cold and bright. Preparations in the royal sept proceeded swiftly. Only a select few were invited to witness the betrothal ceremony. The High Septon's representative, a plump septon in white robes, fussed with the candles and the ribbons that would be used to symbolize the pledge. Ned was there, wearing a cloak of solemn gray. Renly looked resplendent in green and gold, a roguish grin on his lips. Loras stood near Marjorie, his face set in a protective calm. Joffrey appeared late, accompanied by the Hound. The prince wore an expression that hovered between boredom and contempt, as if this entire ceremony was beneath him. Robert arrived with Baratheon and Aerys Oakhart, ignoring the stares from the few courtiers in attendance. Marjorie curtsied before him, dressed in a gown of pale gold, her hair woven with ribbons. Joffrey offered a stiff bow to his father, barely meeting Robert's eyes. Cersei was notably absent. It was her silent protest, a final snub. When all was ready, the Septon intoned the ritual words, speaking of the joining of houses for the greater good of the realm. Marjorie nodded serenely. Joffrey only fidgeted. Robert stood behind them, arms crossed. At the apex of the ceremony, the Septon tied a silk ribbon around Joffrey and Marjorie's wrists, declaring them betrothed by the will of the gods. A smattering of applause rose. Loras inclined his head, proud of his sister. Ned looked on with relief, as though hoping this step might forestall war. Joffrey, for his part, twisted his lips into a sneer. When Marjorie turned to him with a polite smile, he snatched his hand away from the ribbon, nearly tearing the silk. The Septon gave an anxious cough. No one commented on the prince's poor manners, though Robert felt his anger rise. He told himself that if Marjorie could endure Joffrey's temperament, at least the realm would benefit. The ceremony ended. The small party moved to a side chamber to share a cup of spiced wine in celebration. Marjorie gracefully accepted compliments from Ned, Renly, and the few others. Joffrey sulked off to a corner. Robert forced a smile when Marjorie approached, leaning close as the chatter of the others mingled in the background. "My congratulations, Lady Marjorie," Robert said quietly. "I hope your future with Joffrey is manageable." She curtsied. "I am prepared to meet any challenge, Your Grace. This alliance shall serve the realm." But there was a glint of something else in her eyes, determination, perhaps, or steel. Robert admired her fortitude. Just then, a loud voice echoed from the entry, announcing Lord Tywin Lannister. The words sent a hush rippling through the chamber. Guests froze. Loras's hand went to his sword hilt. Robert's heart thudded. Tywin here? In the Red Keep on this very morning? He felt a surge of fury that the man would show up unbidden, no doubt to wreak havoc. Through the doorway stepped Tywin Lannister, clad in crimson and gold, flanked by a dozen lion-helmed guards. His face was as stern and cold as carved stone. Golden hair gone white at the temples, pale green eyes scanning the scene. The tension in the chamber rose to a fever pitch. Even Joffrey, sulking in the corner, seemed startled to see his grandfather. Robert strode forward, calling on all the bravado he could muster. "Lord Tywin, you come unannounced." Tywin inclined his head in a gesture that was not quite a bow. "Your Grace, I was unaware of any law forbidding me from visiting the capital. My men and I arrived this morning. We came to speak with you about urgent matters." Robert scowled. He could sense the swirl of emotions in the room. Loras's readiness to fight, Ned's wariness, Marjorie's watchful caution. "A pity you did not come last night. You missed my son's betrothal ceremony to Lady Marjorie Tyrell." He nearly spat the words, daring Tywin to react. Tywin's eyes flicked to Marjorie, to the ribbon still trailing from her wrist, then to Joffrey. His lips thinned. "So the rumors are true. You have chosen to align yourself with House Tyrell openly. I trust you know the consequences." "If you mean your threats, Tywin, you can keep them," Robert growled. "Or you can declare your intentions now, if you plan to break the king's peace." Tywin moved his gaze slowly over the assembled crowd, every line of his face etched with disdain. "I propose a different path, Your Grace, one that spares the realm a bloody war. We should speak in private." Robert studied him, unsure if this was some trick, but refusing might make him appear fearful. He nodded curtly. "Very well. Ned, Loras with me. The rest of you remain here." Tywin's men bristled, but Tywin waved them off. "I have no need for an entourage in the king's presence." They withdrew into a smaller anteroom, just large enough for a table and a few chairs. Robert sat, Ned and Loras at his flanks. Tywin stood, refusing the courtesy of a seat. A single candle on the table flickered, revealing the lines of age on Tywin's face, the set of his jaw. "This betrothal is an act of open hostility against my house," Tywin began, his voice measured. "You intend to combine Tyrell and Baratheon power, overshadowing the Westerlands. For what reason?" "Because you threatened me," Robert said bluntly. "Demanded I remove my Lord Commander, demanded I dance to your tune like some puppet. I will not." Tywin's nostrils flared. The appointment of Ser Loras was a direct insult to the Kingsguard. Ser Jaime killed a king once. Robert cut him off, voice rising. "Let him serve the realm as he is, or let him quit the White Cloak. I don't care, but Loras Tyrell is my Lord Commander. That's final." Loras stood silent but alert, his presence a reminder of the new power dynamic. Tywin's gaze flicked to him, then back to Robert. "The realm is on the brink of civil war. If you proceed with this alliance and provoke me further, thousands will die. Does that concern you, Your Grace?" Robert scoffed. "Don't speak to me of concern for the realm. You sat out half the rebellion, waiting to see which side would win. You sacked King's Landing when it suited you. Spare me the lecture." A vein in Tywin's temple pulsed, but he kept his composure. "This is your final warning. Abandon this betrothal, dismiss Ser Loras as Lord Commander, and the Lannisters will remain loyal to the crown. Persist, and we march." Robert bared his teeth in something like a grin. "Then march, old lion. I've the Tyrells, the Stormlands, and half the Crownlands. I'll not yield to threats." Tywin's voice went cold as steel. "You will regret this." Loras's hand fell to the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw. Ned stepped forward, fists clenched. Robert rose from his seat. "We're done here. You may stay in the capital if you wish, but if your men cause a single incident, I'll have them arrested. Now get out." Tywin glared. For an instant, it seemed he might unleash a storm of fury. Then he drew a long breath, smoothing his features. "You are a fool, Robert. A fool propped up by roses. Remember that." He turned on his heel and strode out. Robert sank back into his chair, exhaling shakily. Ned exchanged a glance with Loras. War felt closer than ever. Tywin's presence in King's Landing was a brazen move, meant to cow or provoke. Neither man believed it would end peacefully. They emerged to find the main chamber in a flurry of hushed whispers. Tywin and his guard had left, though Joffrey was nowhere to be seen, presumably following his grandfather. Marjorie waited by the dais, anxiety in her gaze as she spotted Loras. He shook his head once, indicating there had been no reconciliation. She pressed her lips together in concern. Robert summoned a squire to bring him stronger wine, though he still resisted the temptation to drink himself blind. He needed his wits. As the others drifted away to reflect on the confrontation, Robert paced the floor. He could almost hear the thunder of distant war drums, the neighing of war horses. If Tywin had come personally, it meant the lines were drawn. The Westerlands would not stand idle while the crown aligned with the Tyrells. Across the Red Keep, Cersei heard of her father's arrival with a combination of triumph and dread. She hurried to find Tywin. They met in a private corridor. She tried to speak, but he silenced her with an imperious gesture. He demanded to know if the betrothal had truly been sealed. When she confirmed it, Tywin's eyes burned. He told her of Robert's defiance, of Loras Tyrell's promotion. Then, to her shock, he issued instructions. "Make ready to leave. I refuse to let you remain here to be humiliated by that drunken oaf. You'll depart King's Landing within the week." Cersei was livid. "I am queen. You are a queen in name only," Tywin said coldly. "This sham of a marriage is done. Robert will cast you aside the moment it suits him. Better for you to be at Casterly Rock, under my protection." "And what of Joffrey?" she demanded. "He is to marry the Tyrell girl. Do you mean for me to abandon my son to them?" Tywin's eyes narrowed. "Joffrey has chosen his path. If he remains, he will be under their thrall soon enough. Let him see where his loyalties truly lie. If it proves too late for him, we will act accordingly. Now, obey me." Cersei trembled with fury. She hated being told what to do, even by her father. But she saw no alternative. In Tywin's presence, she was again a dutiful daughter, not the queen who once believed she commanded all. With stiff submission, she nodded. Her father stalked away, leaving her with a swirl of chaotic emotions. Meanwhile, Robert convened an immediate meeting with Ned, Loras, Stannis, Renly, and any lord in the keep who might be relevant. "Tywin is here," Robert said, pacing before the cold fireplace in the council chamber. "He threatens war. I say we start mustering in full. No more half measures. Let him see we are not to be trifled with." Stannis grunted in agreement. "Agreed. The fleets near Dragonstone are ready to sail if needed. The Stormlands answer Renly's call, and the Crownlands are assembling near Rosby. We can move north to the Riverlands if Tywin tries to cross that region. Or we can hold near the Blackwater to protect the capital." Ned, arms folded, offered a more cautious view. "We should speak to Edmure Tully again. If Tywin heads that W." Robert nodded. "Yes, send word at once. Let Edmure know we expect him to fulfill his vow. If he stands with us, we'll guarantee the security of Riverrun." Renly said nothing, fiddling with a jeweled ring on his finger. Robert wondered if his younger brother had some private ambition swirling in that head of his, but dismissed the thought for the moment. The realm could ill afford fresh intrigues. "And the Tyrells?" Robert prompted. "Has Loras received any new messages?" Loras cleared his throat. "I wrote to my father as soon as the betrothal was sealed. I expect a raven within days. He'll likely gather his full strength. We must be prepared to coordinate if we want to trap Tywin between the Reach and the Crownlands." Robert slammed a fist into his palm. "Good. Let's see if the old lion still roars when he's cornered." They parted with renewed urgency. The next days were a flurry of marches and arrivals. Crownland levies poured into the outskirts of King's Landing, pitching tents and drilling in the fields. Renly departed to muster the Stormlords more personally, leaving a token guard in the city. Stannis remained near Dragonstone, ensuring the coasts were secured. With each fresh arrival, the city became more tense. Food prices rose as soldiers consumed stores. Crime crept up in the shadowed streets, prompting more night patrols. And through it all, Tywin Lannister maintained a small presence in the Red Keep, occupying a suite of rooms as if it were his right. Jaime Lannister vanished from daily guard duty, presumably spending time with his father. Cersei, defying Tywin's order, did not leave at once. Instead, she lingered, fueling rumors that she might attempt to strike at Margaery or sabotage the betrothal. Loras kept a double guard around Margaery's quarters, determined to protect his sister. One evening, as torches flared in the corridors, Ned Stark found himself cornered by Jaime Lannister. It happened near the doors to the throne room, which stood mostly empty at that hour. Jaime stepped out from behind a column, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Ned tensed, resting a palm on the pommel of his own blade. "Lord Stark," Jaime drawled, his voice echoing softly. "I wonder if you have a moment." Ned eyed him coldly. "That depends on what you want, Sir Jaime." Jaime regarded him with a mocking smile. "I'd like to remind you that the Lannisters are not so easily cowed. My father might speak of war, but there is always a path to peace for those who are flexible." His eyes flicked over Ned's face, reading the lines of quiet indignation. "I recall you were once rather unyielding in your pursuit of certain truths. How did that work out for you?" Ned's jaw tightened, recalling how his investigation into the parentage of Cersei's children had ended with his leg shattered and Robert nearly on his deathbed. "Is there a point to this?" Jaime shrugged in feigned nonchalance. "Merely that the realm doesn't need war. If you were to advise your friend the king to step back from this alliance with the Tyrells, my father might be persuaded to keep the peace. My sister might not lose her throne." He tapped a gauntlet finger against the hilt of his sword. "You could preserve many lives." Ned let out a breath, all the old bitterness rising. "You speak to me of preserving lives, Kingslayer?" Jaime's eyes hardened. "Better a single death than thousands. Some men are better off dead." Ned refused to be baited. "If Robert yields, we remain in debt to your house forever. Our sons and daughters will be pawns to your father's will. Is that truly peace?" "You're naive if you think the Tyrells won't do the same or worse," Jaime retorted. "But have it your way. I only came to offer you a chance." His mouth curled in a grin. "If war comes, we'll see each other again, perhaps on the battlefield. Good day, Lord Stark." He turned and strode away, leaving Ned seething. The vow in Ned's heart only deepened. He would not let the Lannisters control the throne or claim the realm's freedom. If that meant war, so be it. 2 days later, word arrived from Highgarden. Mace Tyrell had raised an army larger than any seen in recent memory, some whispering it might rival the force from the days of the Targaryen invasions. They were marching north toward the Rose Road, making for King's Landing or wherever the king might need them. Robert received the news with grim satisfaction. Now they had a bulwark if Tywin attempted to march east. The old lion might find himself pinned between the host of Highgarden and the loyal levies of the Crownlands. That evening, as Robert took supper in his private solar with Ned and Loras, a new raven arrived. This one bore the seal of Riverrun. Ned opened the parchment, scanning the words with mounting tension. "Edmure Tully," he read out loud, "agrees to oppose any Lannister incursion into the Riverlands. He's already summoned his banners. The Blackfish rides at the head of Riverrun's forces." Robert exhaled. "Then Tywin is surrounded. If he marches on the city, the Tyrells come from the south, the Tullys from the north. We hold the Crownlands. That's 3 armies. I'd almost feel sorry for him if he hadn't forced our hand." Loras set down his cup of watered wine, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He might still choose not to attack. No matter what else one can say of Lord Tywin, he is no fool. He knows the odds. Ned agreed, though he was less optimistic. "We must remain vigilant. A cornered lion is at its most dangerous." They had no idea how prophetic those words would prove. The very next night, a heavy storm rolled in from the sea, battering King's Landing with wind and torrential rain. Thunder boomed. Lightning split the sky. Many soldiers huddled in tents outside the walls, cursing the weather. The city's inhabitants rushed to bar their shutters, and few dared to roam the streets. Inside the Red Keep, the corridors were eerily quiet, torch flames guttering in the drafts that whistled around corners. The king attempted to sleep early, Yet he woke past midnight to urgent banging on his chamber door. He jolted upright, adrenaline surging, half expecting assassins. Loras Tyrell's voice called, "Your Grace, let me in." Robert rose, grabbing a robe and yanking open the door. Loras stood with two white-cloaked knights behind him, his face pale. "What is it?" Robert demanded. "There was an attack on Lady Marjorie's chambers," Loras said in a tight voice. "We found two men inside armed with daggers. The guards killed one, but the other fled. Marjorie is safe, but 7 hells?" Robert breathed, heart pounding. "Anyone know who sent them?" Loras shook his head, fury etched in every line of his face. "They wore no sigils, but the dead one had golden hair and a small lion medallion hidden on him. I suspect Lannister men, or in their employ." Rage flared in Robert's chest, fierce as a wildfire. "Where is Marjorie now?" "In the White Sword Tower under heavy guard," Loras said. "My sister is shaken, but unhurt." Robert shoved a hand through his hair, cursing. "That does it. Tywin's gone too far. He tries to murder my son's betrothed under my own roof." Loras exhaled, trying to steady himself. "We have no proof it was Tywin's direct order. But who else would do this?" Robert's mind reeled. He thought of Cersei, too, who might have decided that if she could not stop the betrothal with words, she might do so with blood. "Bring me the body," he ordered. "I want to see the man's face." They rushed through the dark corridors, the storm raging outside. They reached the small courtyard near Marjorie's suite. Guards with torches formed a ring around the corpse. The man lay on his back, eyes staring sightlessly at the rain falling into them. Indeed, he had pale blonde hair. In his clenched fist was a dagger, the blade stained with blood from a guard's wound, apparently. Loras nudged the man's tunic aside. Underneath was a small golden lion charm on a leather thong around his neck. Robert knelt, the rain soaking his robe, and ripped the medallion free. He held it up to the torchlight. "A lion," he muttered. He turned to Loras. "Take this to Tywin. I want his explanation." Loras straightened. "At once, Your Grace." Robert scowled. "But be cautious. He might not be in his chambers. He might have fled. If so, search for Jaime or Cersei. Arrest them if needed. I'll not have them strike at us again." Loras nodded sharply, beckoning to a half-dozen guards. They strode off into the windy night. Robert stared down at the corpse, mind racing. Ned arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, and took in the scene with grim understanding. "War, then?" Ned said softly, though it was more a statement than a question. Robert rose, clenching the medallion. "Yes," he said, voice raw. "War." In the hours before dawn, the storm continued unabated. Scouts discovered that Tywin Lannister's chambers were empty, his men gone. Jaime was missing too, along with a contingent of Lannister guards. Servants reported seeing them depart quietly through a postern gate earlier in the evening, presumably slipping out of the city under cover of darkness and rain. They might already be on the King's Road west, riding hard for the Westerlands. Robert paced the throne room while Ned, Loras, and a host of guards stood by. Thunder rattled the windows. The king barked orders to dispatch riders to seal the gates, though it was likely too late. The Lannisters had taken advantage of the chaos of the storm. If they reached Tywin's main army, war was certain. At last, near dawn, the rain began to subside. Robert settled heavily onto the Iron Throne, ignoring the jagged edges that bit into his flesh. Torches hissed as water dripped from the high windows. The hall was nearly empty save for his closest allies and some City Watch officers. Loras stood with a protective stance near Ned, Marjorie by his side, pale but composed. Renly was not present. He had already left for the Stormlands. Stannis, too, was away, but Robert would not wait for them to return. He surveyed those assembled. "Tywin Lannister has fled, and an assassin tried to kill my son's betrothed," he said, his voice resonating through the chamber. "I won't let this pass. Let the realm know. House Lannister stands in open rebellion against the crown. We call the banners, all of them. We meet the West with the combined might of the Crownlands, the Stormlands, the Reach, and any who hold faith with the king. A hush fell. Loras bowed stiffly. Highgarden will not fail you. Ned spoke quietly but firmly. Nor will the North, if we can send word to Winterfell. But, you know the North faces its own perils. I can only speak for my own bannermen. Robert nodded. We'll take what we can get, Ned. We'll gather enough to end Tywin's threat once and for all. Let him see that the realm stands against his tyranny. He rose from the throne, ignoring the ache in his side that flared with the movement. The memory of nearly dying to a boar felt distant now, overshadowed by the new war that loomed. Summon the lords. Prepare the men. Within a fortnight we march. And so it was proclaimed throughout King's Landing. The king called the banners, intending to ride out personally to meet the Lannister forces if, and likely when, they came. The battered roads would run black with soldiers' boots and hooves. The smithies rang day and night, forging weapons. Provisions were gathered, wagons readied. Ordinary folk trembled, recalling the horrors of earlier wars. The rebellion had left deep scars, and the small folk feared new ones. In the weeks that followed, a clarion call sounded across the Crownlands. Lords great and small answered, albeit with varying speed. Some feared the might of the Golden Lion, but Robert's name still had weight, especially when bolstered by Highgarden's promise. Ravens flew to the Stormlands, the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, and Dorne, though no one expected much from Dorne. The old wounds of the Martells still ran deep. Within King's Landing, Robert prepared for the campaign. He insisted on trying on his old armor, though Pycelle and others advised caution. The king's wound was not yet fully healed, but Robert refused to be left behind. Every time his side ached, he muttered that the boar had done him a favor, keeping him sharp for the battle to come. He met regularly with Loras, Ned, and the captains of the City Watch, laying out strategies. Marjorie wrote often to her father, coordinating the approach from the Reach. The plan was to converge at a strategic crossroads near the Blackwater Rush, forming a combined host that would either stand to defend the capital or move west to intercept Tywin. Cersei vanished. Rumors spread that she had fled the city as well, possibly seeking to rejoin her father. Others whispered that she might have hidden somewhere in King's Landing, waiting to strike in some last act of vengeance. Robert put a price on the head of any Lannister man found skulking in the city. Yet no clear sign of the Queen emerged. Jaime was also gone, presumably leading a contingent to rejoin Tywin. Joffrey, to Robert's frustration, seemed uncertain whom he truly served. But the boy was under constant watch, and Marjorie took it upon herself to maintain a semblance of courtesy with him. She told Loras in confidence that Joffrey seemed terrified, swinging between fury and fear with each day. If Robert marched to war, the city might be left with a bitter, resentful prince. At last, the day of departure arrived. A bright morning sun rose over King's Landing, illuminating columns of knights, men-at-arms, and supply wagons stretching from the Red Keep gates to the outskirts of the city. Banners fluttered in the breeze, golden stags on black for House Baratheon, dire wolves for the northern knights who had already arrived, green rose standards for House Tyrell's vanguard, though the main Tyrell host would meet them along the road, and myriad lesser sigils from the Crownlands. Trumpets sounded. The City Watch parted to let the King's Guard pass. Robert rode at the head of the column, mounted on a massive warhorse, his breastplate gleaming in the sun. His cloak billowed behind him, displaying the crowned stag. At his right rode Ned Stark, solemn, wearing plate dyed gray, and at his left rode Ser Loras Tyrell, Lord Commander in white cloak and shining armor. The Tyrell rose on a small crest pinned near his shoulder to signify his house. Behind them came Barristan Selmy, Ser Aerys Oakhart, and the rest of the Kingsguard, forming a gleaming retinue of white. The mood among the soldiers was a tense mixture of anticipation and dread. Some felt emboldened by the king's presence, remembering stories of his prowess in the rebellion. Others worried that Tywin Lannister, cunning and ruthless, would entrap them in some cunning maneuver. All of them knew the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. Marjorie stood on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, flanked by a dozen ladies and servants. She gave Robert a measured farewell, her eyes shining. "The gods go with you, your grace. May you return victorious." Joffrey lingered behind her, scowling. Whether from worry or jealousy, none could say. But the betrothal was sealed, and Marjorie was now a fixture in court. Should Robert fall, or if Joffrey rose to the throne, she would still be a powerful presence. With Loras in the king's retinue, Marjorie was left behind in the Red Keep, protected by knights loyal to her father, the City Watch, and some of the Kingsguard designated to guard the royal family. Robert raised a mailed hand in acknowledgement. With a loud cry, the trumpets blared again, and the king urged his horse forward. Step by thunderous step, the army poured out of the city gates, a river of steel and flesh. Onlookers crowded the streets, some cheering, some weeping, as the host marched. Children ran alongside, enthralled by the spectacle. Older folk murmured prayers to the Seven for deliverance from the horrors that might follow. Once beyond the walls, the host turned westward, following the roads that would take them toward the Blackwater Rush. There, they intended to rendezvous with the Tyrell main force, then either proceed deeper into the Crownlands or pivot north to block Tywin, depending on his movements. Scouts fanned out, searching for any sign of Lannister outriders or infiltration. None appeared in the first days. Robert felt a strange excitement coursing through his veins. Here, in the field, surrounded by the thunder of hooves and the glitter of spears, he was once again the warrior of old, not the drunken shadow who had wasted years on meaningless indulgences. His side hurt often, but he grit his teeth through the pain, refusing to show weakness. Ned rode beside him in silence, occasionally exchanging quiet words about scouting reports. Loras, too, remained watchful, his eyes scanning the rolling hills ahead. The roads were damp from recent rains, mud caking the horses' hooves. The men trudged on, forging a path of resilience. They passed small villages, where the local folk bowed or looked on in awe. Robert gave orders that no pillaging was to be tolerated. "We are not an invading army," he barked at the quartermasters. "We are the king's host, and these are my subjects, not spoils." At night they made camp. Ned, Loras, and Baratheon oversaw the security details, ensuring watchfires burned bright and patrols circled the perimeter. Soldiers sang old marching tunes or whispered rumors of the Lannisters lurking just beyond the next ridge. Sometimes, Robert would leave his tent to walk among them, ignoring the protests of his advisors. He spoke a few words to the men, sharing a jug of ale, though he took only a sip, asking about their homes. The men seemed both astonished and heartened by his presence. He was, for a time, the Robert Baratheon they had heard tales of, a warrior king who had once toppled dragons. On the 5th day, they met the vanguard of House Tyrell, a contingent of 1,000 knights and footmen, banners sporting the golden rose on green. Their commander bowed low, presenting a sealed message from Mace Tyrell. In it, Mace wrote that the full Tyrell host would be but 2 days behind. He also brought news that Tywin Lannister had been seen in the Riverlands, possibly heading for a crossing of the Red Fork. Clashes had already erupted with Edmure Tully's men. This meant Tywin was not forging directly east to King's Landing. He was aiming to secure a strong position in the Riverlands first. Robert called a war council in a large pavilion where the Tyrell vanguard had set up. Maps were unrolled on a rough wooden table. Torches flickered, casting shadows that danced over the lines and sigils. Ned pointed to the Riverlands. If Tywin is here, near the Red Fork, he might be heading for Harrenhal or simply raiding Tully's lands to draw us north. Robert nodded. "We can't let him isolate the Tullys. If he defeats them, or forces them to yield, he'll have a clear path east and might even circle behind us." He turned to the Tyrell Knights. "We must join forces quickly, then move north to relieve Edmure Tully. That's the best way to ensure Tywin can't pick us apart." The Tyrell commander agreed. "Lord Tyrell will be here soon with the bulk of our men. He supports that plan." So they marched north. The countryside grew more rugged, dotted with winding rivers and thick groves of trees. Robert's host swelled with each passing day as more Tyrell banners arrived. Scouts reported the movements of Tully forces. They were attempting to hold the fords against Lannister outriders. Skirmishes flared, though no major battle had been joined yet. Each day Robert hoped they. Loras rode near Robert often, conferring with Ned about tactics. Robert took note of how Loras and Ned, two men so different in age and temperament, had begun to trust each other's perspectives. Loras's cunning, Ned's steady honor. Together, they shaped the king's decisions into balanced plans. At last, near the southern edge of the Riverlands, they found a suitable place to unite with Mace Tyrell's main army. A broad valley dotted with farmland, a stream flowing through its center. Word came that Mace Tyrell would arrive by sundown. The king's host set up a makeshift camp, the men straining from days of travel. Robert insisted on a large command pavilion for the war council. As the evening sky blazed red, horns sounded the approach of the Tyrell main column. Loras stepped forward, scanning the lines. More men than Robert had seen gathered in many a year crested the distant ridge. Ranks of spearmen, knights on horseback, archers in formation. Banners of green and gold bobbed in a sea of color. The ground seemed to quake beneath the weight of thousands of boots and hooves. At the head, riding a richly adorned steed, came Mace Tyrell himself, flanked by standard-bearers. The sight of him might have stirred laughter in peacetime, with his girth and pomp, but now he cut a more imposing figure as the head of so mighty an army. Robert, Ned, and Loras mounted their horses to greet the Tyrell lord. Baratheon, ever watchful, rode alongside them. They met in the center of the valley, heralds exchanging formalities. Mace Tyrell bowed from his saddle, sending a ripple of sweat down his jowls. "Your Grace, at last we meet in the field. House Tyrell has answered your call." Robert inclined his head. "I see you've brought half the reach, Lord Tyrell." Mace chuckled, though it was forced. "We had an inkling we might need them all. Word travels that Lord Tywin Lannister moves against the Riverlands. Let us put a stop to his ambitions." Ned introduced himself politely, and Mace returned the courtesy. Then their combined forces found space to encamp. That night, a grand war council took shape under the largest pavilion. Mace Tyrell arrived with his bannermen. Randyll Tarly, Mathis Rowan, Garland Tyrell, Loras's older brother, and others of note. Robert's side included Ned, Loras, Baratheon, and various Crownland lords. The assembled group circled around the map spread on a massive table, lit by torches that sputtered in the night breeze. Randyll Tarly, a stern-faced veteran, tapped the location near the Red Fork. Lord Tywin's host was last reported crossing here. Edmure Tully's men contest the fords but can't hold out forever. If Tywin breaks through, he may swing south to attempt an ambush on us. Alternatively, he could march on Riverrun to force Edmure's surrender. Mace Tyrell stroked his trimmed beard. "We must link up with the Tullys swiftly. A combined front would outnumber Tywin significantly." Ned nodded. "We can be at the fords in 4 or 5 days if we push. Fewer if the men can handle hard marching." Robert set his jaw. "We push. If we can force Tywin to battle on open ground, we'll crush him between our might and the Tully defenders. No more letting him choose the battlefield." Loras, studying the map, glanced at Tarly. "What if Tywin withdraws into the hills near Harrenhal, luring us into unfavorable terrain? We should plan for that." Tarly's thin mouth twitched. "Then we prepare detachments to flank him. Harrenhal is a strong castle, but maintaining supply lines there might be difficult for Tywin, especially with Tully men harassing him." The discussion wore on for hours, the air in the pavilion growing stale. Yet the plan was clear by the end. They would march north at first light, men in tight columns, scouts fanning out. They would aim for the major fords along the Red Fork, hoping to relieve Tully's forces or catch the Lannisters crossing. Meanwhile, small detachments under Tarly would circle west to guard against any attempt by Tywin to slip away. Robert was satisfied. As the council dispersed, Mace Tyrell lingered to speak privately with the king. "Your Grace, I am pleased to see my daughter's betrothal has borne fruit. I pray she remains safe in King's Landing." "She is well guarded," Robert said, though he recalled the attempt on her life. "Your daughter has proven resourceful. The people admire her." Mace smiled, though his eyes were calculating. "I look forward to the wedding. Once Tywin is dealt with, we shall see the realm united under your house and mine." Robert nodded curtly, fighting off the familiar resentment at being beholden to a major house. Still, this was the cost of forging alliances. "Yes, the realm united," he repeated, forcing optimism into his voice. Morning came, a gray dawn with clouds scudding across the sky. The combined host of Baratheons and Tyrells, bolstered by knights from crownland houses and a contingent of Ned's men from the north, set out northward. The columns stretched for miles, a fearsome display of martial power. The small folk in the riverlands, upon seeing them pass, looked on with wide eyes, hope dawning in their expressions. Perhaps this grand alliance would finally check Tywin's relentless destruction. For days they marched, the roads turning muddy in patches, the weather shifting between drizzle and sunlight. Scouts reported Lannister outriders near the Red Fork, but no major engagements. Edmure Tully's men were holding. Tarly's flanking force scoured the western roads. Every night, Robert and Mace Tyrell gathered with their commanders to refine their approach. Tensions flared occasionally among the lesser lords. Some old rivalries from the Reach or the Crownlands threatened to surface. Loras and Ned worked tirelessly to mediate, ensuring no cracks appeared in their unity. At last, on a crisp morning, word came that Lannister banners had been spotted to the northwest, massing near a crossing called Stone Mill. Edmure's men were entrenched there, but heavily outnumbered. If Tywin smashed through, he could drive deeper into Tully Land or pivot south to flank the king's host. The time for stealth was over. Robert gave the order to make haste for Stone Mill. They would meet Tywin in open battle and decide the fate of the realm. The final day's march was grueling. Soldiers stumbled with exhaustion. Horses neighed in protest. Yet adrenaline and the promise of imminent battle carried them forward. Ned and Loras rode at the vanguard with Robert, scanning the horizon for any glimpse of the Red Fork. The wind carried the faint smell of water and churned mud. They glimpsed distant columns of smoke, perhaps from the burning of small farms near the front lines. By dusk, they reached a ridge overlooking the river valley. Below lay Stone Mill, a cluster of buildings around a stone bridge that spanned the Red Fork. Beyond it, to the west, campfires glimmered in the twilight. Thousands of them, the Lannister host. Even from this distance, Robert could see the flicker of torches, the shapes of tents. The Golden Lion banners were faint but unmistakable. On the near side of the river, Edmure Tully's men had formed a line of defenses, holding the approach to the mill and the bridge. Loras pointed out that part of the line seemed battered, suggesting recent skirmishes. Robert lifted a hand, signaling a halt. The hush that fell over his assembled knights was profound. They gazed down at the battlefield, hearts pounding. Tomorrow, they would meet the Lannisters in a clash that would echo across the Seven Kingdoms. The king closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool wind on his face. "Have the men set camp here," Robert ordered, his voice quiet yet carrying authority. "Post guards. At first light, we array for battle." The war horns sounded, passing the message down the lines. Squires and quartermasters scrambled, setting up a sprawling camp on the high ground. The river's dark shimmer was visible whenever a flash of torchlight reflected on its surface. Ned and Loras exchanged a glance of steeled resolve. Mace Tyrell arrived with a retinue of bannermen, all bristling with anticipation. In his tent that night, Robert donned a simpler tunic, ignoring the throbbing in his side. He drank only a single cup of watered wine. His head swirled with memories of the Trident, of the day he'd felled Rhaegar Targaryen in a torrent of fury and blood. He remembered the adrenaline, the exultation, and the grief. Now he faced Tywin Lannister, a different sort of foe but one no less formidable. The realm stood on the cusp of either uniting behind its king or fracturing into ruin. A messenger arrived, one of Tully's men, breathless and mud-splattered. He brought news. Tywin had attacked at dawn that day, testing Edmure's lines. The fighting was fierce, but Edmure held. However, the Lannisters seemed poised to strike again in the morning. The Tully men were heartened by the king's approach, confident that dawn would bring reinforcements. Robert dismissed the messenger with thanks, then beckoned Loras to join him. They stood by a brazier in the tent, the coals casting dancing shadows on the canvas walls. "How do you feel, Lord Commander?" Robert asked. Loras looked down at his hands. "Eager to fight, your grace. Eager to prove that the Kingsguard is worthy." Robert studied the young knight's face. "You've done well, Loras. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember your vows. Keep your head clear, your sword arm steady." A flicker of a wry grin touched Robert's lips. "And watch mine too. I'm not quite the warrior I once was." Loras dipped his head. "I will guard you with my life." Robert rested a hand on Loras's shoulder. "See that you don't have to throw it away. We need every good man we can muster." Night deepened, quiet settling over the camp except for the occasional whinny of horses or the low murmur of patrols. The armies on both sides prepared for what the morrow would bring: battle, blood, and a clash that might decide the future of the Seven Kingdoms. Rain threatened, clouds scudding across the moon, but only a light drizzle fell, pattering against the canvas. Robert tried to sleep in his tent, but his mind refused to rest. Memories of the boar's tusks sank into him again, of nearly bleeding out in the forest, of Ned's worried face as he hovered. He was not that man any longer. If tomorrow was to be his final day, he would face it as the warrior he had once been. Dawn came with gray skies, a haze clinging to the valley. The horns of House Baratheon and House Tyrell sounded the call to arms. Men donned armor, strapped on swords, formed ranks under their banners. Horses pawed the ground, snorting clouds of vapor in the chill air. Robert emerged from his tent, fully armored in black steel with gold accents, the crowned stag emblazoned on his breastplate. He felt the old thrill as he hefted a warhammer, a new one forged in the style of the weapon that had broken Rhaegar. The weight was comforting in his hands. He mounted his warhorse with a grunt, ignoring the pain in his side. Ned Stark rode up beside him, the Stark direwolf on his shield. Loras Tyrell, in gleaming armor white as snow, took position on the king's left. Barristan Selmy, face grave, placed himself just behind Robert, a silent guardian. The columns advanced down the slope toward Stone Mill, where they could already hear the faint clash of steel, Edmure Tully's men skirmishing with the Lannisters. The roars of the battlefield reached them through the mist. As the Alliance host neared the front lines, the terrain opened into a wide plain stretching to the river. They could see Tully men locked in combat with Lannister infantry near the mill, red and silver banners swirling among the carnage. To the west, the bulk of Tywin's army was arrayed, golden lions visible even in the dim morning light, ranks of archers and knights forming up. The sight of Tywin's banners reminded Robert of the unstoppable wave of soldiers that had once sacked King's Landing. Now, fate had brought them face to face again. Trumpets blared on both sides. Mace Tyrell's vanguard formed to the left, Ned Stark and the Crownland Knights to the center, Robert and the main cavalry to the right. War cries rose. Drummers pounded out a rhythm that quickened the heartbeat of every soldier. Robert raised his warhammer high, voice booming. "Forward! For the realm!" A thunderous roar answered him. The mass of men and horses surged across the plain. Arrows whistled overhead, some striking shields, others falling among the ranks. Through the smoke of battlefield fires, Robert glimpsed the Lannister line bracing for impact. He urged his warhorse faster, blood singing in his ears. At his side, Ned Stark and Loras Tyrell kept pace, each leading their own contingents. The ground shook beneath the charge, and then they clashed. The two armies met in a maelstrom of steel and screams, horses screaming as lances struck home. Robert bellowed, swinging his warhammer in a wide arc, smashing a Lannister knight from the saddle. Blood sprayed, the momentum carrying him deeper into the fray. Ned carved a path with calm efficiency, his sword cutting down those who dared stand before him. Loras fought with dazzling speed, his white cloak billowing, as if the gods had sent a bright blade among the gloom. Chaos enveloped them. Smoke from burning wagons stung the eyes. The muddy ground churned with blood. Tully archers loosed volleys into the Lannister flank. Tyrell knights hammered at the western lines. Robert saw a flash of gold armor, some knight of the west lunging at him. He ducked a sword blow, retaliated with a crushing strike of his hammer. The man collapsed, helmet dented in. Another came. Robert roared, unstoppable for a moment, living the fierce glory he had missed for so long. Off to one side, he spotted Ned locked in a deadly struggle against 3 Lannister men. Robert spurred his horse forward, barreling into one of them and sending the man sprawling. Ned dispatched another with a swift slash. The third fled. They exchanged a grim nod. The moment of camaraderie cut short as new foes converged. In the swirl of mud and blood, Robert felt his side burn anew. Every swing of his hammer jarred the old wound, but he pressed on. The roars of battle, the clang of steel, the whinnying of terrified horses, it all blended into a cacophony. Arrows hissed overhead, some finding victims. The Lannister line buckled in places, but Tywin's men were disciplined, refusing to break easily. Not far off, Loras Tyrell dueled a Lannister banner knight. Swords flashed, the ring of metal sharp. Loras's white armor was streaked with blood, but he moved with a dancer's grace. He battered aside the knight's guard and delivered a final thrust, the man toppling with a groan. Loras turned to defend a fellow Tyrell bannerman who was beset by 2 foes. The boy's skill was breathtaking, but the sheer chaos of the battlefield threatened even the finest swordsman. Wounded men moaned in the mud. War horses, hamstrung or gutted, lay thrashing. The reek of spilled entrails mixed with the pungent odor of sweat and fear. Robert's arms felt leaden after uncounted swings of the hammer. He paused to wipe blood from his brow, scanning for any sign of Tywin or Jaime. Neither was visible among the carnage. Likely they were at the rear, directing the battle. He had an urge to drive straight into the heart of the Lannister host to find them, but he knew his duty was to lead, not to indulge personal vengeance. Gradually, the tide shifted. The Tully men, emboldened by reinforcements, pressed forward on the left, retaking ground near the mill. The Tyrell forces battered the Lannister center, forcing them to yield steps. Robert's cavalry hammered the Lannister right flank. Yet Tywin's ranks did not shatter. They pulled back in controlled increments, forming new lines, lashing out with counterattacks. Every foot of ground was contested fiercely. Hours passed in brutal struggle. The sun climbed higher, revealing the full horror of the battlefield. Corpses sprawled, many clad in the red and gold of Lannister or the gold rose of Tyrell. Robert realized that if this continued, the realm would bleed rivers. But perhaps that was the price to break Tywin's power. A sudden horn blast signaled an event on the western edge. Mace Tyrell and Randall Tarley had broken through a portion of the Lannister line, sending them into disarray. This forced Tywin's men to shift resources, weakening the center. Sensing the opportunity, Robert bellowed for a final push. His knights rallied, surging into the gap. The Lannister banners began to waver, yet Tywin's men regrouped a short distance away, forming a defensive circle around a ridge. Robert realized they were stalling for a retreat. Indeed, horns sounded from the Lannister side, and many knights began withdrawing, covering each other's escape. "Press them!" Robert roared, though the remains of the Lannister line put up a stubborn rear guard, stalling any pursuit. Eventually, battered and bloodied, the combined Crown forces forced the Lannisters from the field, but not without heavy cost. The sun dipped again, turning the sky gold and red as it had been at dawn, though the terrain was now soaked in gore. The stone mill area was a wasteland of broken bodies, burned wagons, shattered weapons. Edmure Tully's men cheered to see the Lannisters retreat, though at least half of them were wounded or dead. The Tyrell and Crownland casualties were also severe. Robert, exhausted, dismounted near the riverbank where the water ran red with blood. Loras and Ned soon joined him, both spattered with filth and blood, breathing hard. Baratheon stood watch, sword dripping. None spoke for a long moment, letting the reality of victory and its terrible cost settle in. Finally, Ned said, "They've withdrawn west, likely to regroup. Tywin may attempt to hold Harrenhal or retreat further. We've dealt them a major blow." Robert nodded, chest heaving. "Aye, but how many men did we lose?" Loras closed his eyes. "Too many." The king stared across the field, where crows already circled. Soldiers moved among the fallen, seeking survivors. The stench of death hung thick. "This is the price," Robert muttered, "to keep the realm free of his yoke." He hefted his hammer one last time and let it rest against the ground, leaning on the haft. His side throbbed in agony. He wondered if the realm was worth saving, when every inch of it seemed to demand another body, another river of blood. But he banished the doubt. Someone had to stand against the lion's threats. If not him, who? Ned placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "We did what we must." Robert nodded, then lifted his gaze to the blackening sky. The taste of iron lingered in his mouth, and the wind carried the distant screams of the wounded. Yet somewhere beyond the horizon, Marjorie Tyrell waited in King's Landing, forging a new future. The Tyrell army had fought bravely, and the realm, though wounded, remained unbroken. In that moment, Robert Baratheon, the battered king, the survivor of Boar's tusks and betrayals, felt a spark of resolve deeper than any he had known in years. He would see this through no matter how many battles remained. The Lannisters would learn that the fury of the stag and the resilience of the rose could not be quelled. So the ravens flew, bearing word of the battle at Stone Mill. The king had prevailed. Tywin Lannister was in retreat. The realm held its breath, waiting to see if Tywin would strike again or if the combined might of Baratheon and Tyrell had broken his ambition once and for all. For Robert, for Loras Tyrell, for Ned Stark, and for every soldier on that bloody field, the war was far from over. But they had taken the first step in forging a new realm, one free of the old ghosts that haunted the Iron Throne. And in the days ahead, Robert Baratheon would seize that chance with all the strength still left in his weary body, determined that the Seven Kingdoms would know a king's wrath and a king's mercy, and not a lion's roar of gold.